Hey there. If you're new, welcome to the channel. If you're a regular, welcome back. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Let me know in the comments. Now, sit back, relax, and let the stories begin. One night, I was staying over at my friend's place because she had a stalker. She had asked me, a 6'3" amateur cage fighter, to stay with her since her roommate was out of town. She was scared of this guy who'd been following her around the town, trying to get her to go out with him. She had male friends who would have probably been better for intimidating someone like that, but she didn't feel comfortable asking them to stay with her. I reassured her before she went to sleep, telling her nothing would happen, and I'd stay awake in the living room to keep an eye out. Around 3 a.m., I heard some strange noises outside. My gut told me right away it was him. I started thinking about other stalking cases I knew of, and I made up my mind if he gave me any reason, I would hurt him badly. He wouldn't be able to walk again. I know that sounds cold, but I've been told by several specialists that I have psychopathic tendencies, which makes me feel less empathy for others and less restrained when it comes to defending myself. It's something that helped me become a good fighter. I know stalkers tend to fixate and won't give up, so if he got inside, I was ready to deal with him. I quietly moved into a corner of the living room, staying in the shadows, and I stayed silent. Then, I heard the doorknob jiggle and the sound of someone picking the lock. The door creaked open, and my heart dropped into my stomach when I saw not only that he had a gun, but that I recognized him. He was a fellow fighter, one I'd faced in the ring before, and I had no intention of fighting him again, especially with a firearm in his hand. My friend had come to a few of my matches, and that's probably where he had seen her for the first time. I stayed completely still as he crept across the room, heading straight for my friend's bedroom. Normally, I wasn't used to facing people with more than just their fists, but I knew how to handle myself, even if this time I felt a sudden sense of dread. My friend and her roommate had just moved in, and the room was sparse, just a couch, TV, and a cabinet. There was nothing I could use to defend myself. I quietly moved behind him just as he was about to open the door. Without hesitation, I grabbed the gun from his hand, unloaded the entire magazine into him. My friend screamed at the top of her lungs, and I took a moment to calm her down. Just then, we heard a knock at the door. I grabbed the gun, thinking it could be a bluff against any possible accomplices, but my friend told me, from the voice outside, that it was just her neighbor. We let him in, and soon after, the police arrived. I went down to the station with the cops to answer their questions and was let go without facing any charges for what had happened. A couple of weeks later, I found out the guy's sister was charging me with murder. When it went to court, the judge just laughed it off. Killing someone with a gun instead of just using my fists was a huge jump for me, and it made me sick to think about it. From that moment on, I couldn't even think about violence without feeling a sense of guilt. I quit fighting and moved in with that same friend, hoping to stay away from any more incidents and surround myself with kinder people, especially since she was such a sweetheart. In the end, I was glad I traded my violent tendencies for her safety. It was the best way I could grow a conscience. It's worth noting, though, that I've seen the guy's sister around a few times since then. She always keeps her distance, so I'm sure it's just a coincidence. But hopefully Psycho doesn't run in the family. I'm 29 and live along the Appalachian Range in lower West Virginia. For years, I've enjoyed backpacking and camping, exploring various trails around the nearby mountains. My best friend, who lives just a few miles away, often joins me on these trips. Every fall, we plan one major trail, typically lasting from a few days to a week. In 2019, we had planned a hike across the range to a small lake atop the mountains. However, just before the trip, my friend had to cancel due to a work emergency. Since I'd already taken the entire week off work and had everything prepared, I decided to go alone. On Monday morning, I drove to the nearest trailhead and began my journey. This wasn't a typical recreational hike. It was a backpacking trail without a clearly marked path. I had to rely on maps, compasses, and natural landmarks to find my way. Generally, you'd focus on a major feature in the distance, like a distinctive rock formation. Once you reach it, you could spot the next landmark and so on. The first 2 days of hiking were toward a ridge in the mountains. As darkness fell on the second day, I set up camp several hours from the ridge. I pitched my tent, lit a fire, and began cooking some of the food I had packed. The sun had already set, and by around 8 o'clock, I was in my tent reading, keeping the fire burning with plans to extinguish it before going to sleep. About 20 minutes into reading, I heard a sharp stick snap right behind my tent. I jumped up. My first thought was that it was a black bear, likely attracted by the smell of my food. But after a moment of silence, I didn't hear anything else. I crawled out of the tent and shone my flashlight toward the tree line behind me. Nothing. I called out loudly to try and scare away any wildlife. But once again, there was no sound of anything running off. It was strange because the sound of the stick snapping was unmistakable, like something had stepped on it. I stayed outside for a while, scanning the area, before finally putting out the fire and retreating inside. I found it difficult to sleep that night, as I was hyper-aware of every noise. To my surprise, I managed to sleep through the night. The next morning, I packed up my campsite and continued my journey toward the ridge. From there, it would be a direct path to the lake. I pushed myself, hoping to reach the lake before nightfall, so I wouldn't have to move my camp again the following day. I made it with an hour to spare before sunset. The lake was beautiful, definitely worth the hike. After strolling around, I set up my tent and camp on the tree line next to the lake. As I sat by the fire, I kept hearing faint noises coming from the trees behind me. I brushed it off as paranoia, but it still felt unnerving. It sounded almost like footsteps, but I knew no one else could be out here. I would have noticed any other tents when I walked around the lake. By this point, it was too dark to see anything beyond a few feet, so I couldn't investigate further. About an hour later, I crawled into my tent to sleep. Every few minutes, I would hear the footsteps again. They were faint enough that I couldn't be sure. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I fell asleep. What felt like only an hour later, I was woken by the sound of someone running away from my tent. I bolted upright, grabbed my flashlight, and rushed outside, shining the light in the direction of the footsteps. I saw a figure running away in the distance. My heart was racing. As I looked down, I saw footprints all around my tent, like someone had been circling me, checking out my camp. I hurriedly got the fire going again, desperate to see more clearly. Fear was gripping me. I was all alone with nowhere to go, and nobody to help. I stayed by the fire the rest of the night, constantly on alert, but nothing else happened. In the morning, I snapped a few photos of the lake, then began my hike back. Although I had planned to stay another day, I just couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I made it back without any more incidents, thankfully. But as I went, I started to notice small things missing from my backpack. Food, tools, etc. I always kept my bag with me. To this day, I wonder if whoever had been lurking outside my tent that night had snuck inside and taken things while I slept. The thought still sends chills down my spine. My name's Riley, and I'm a 26-year-old guy from Milwaukee. This story took place about 3 years ago, and I can assure you it's all true. Here's a bit of background. It was late summer, probably early September, when my friends and I decided to go on an urban exploration. We'd done this sort of thing before, mainly in some of the rundown parts of Milwaukee, usually on the northern side. It was risky, given the area's history with drugs, gang violence, and squatters, but we were always careful. We'd had pretty good luck, never running into anyone too dangerous. We were just fascinated by what was inside the buildings, and it gave us a bit of a thrill. On this particular night, there were 5 of us going. It was me, my friends Jamie, Kevin, Vin, and Ty. We were all around the same age, except for Ty, who was 29. We'd all gone to the same high school in Bayside, a suburb where we had lived. Jamie was the only girl with us and also happened to be the one driving us there in her large SUV, which could fit all of us comfortably. She was also dating Kevin at the time. So, We piled into the SUV and headed up to North Milwaukee, driving past some pretty rough neighborhoods and abandoned buildings. The place we were heading to was an old elementary school that had been shut down in the late 90s. We found out about it through an Urban Explorer Facebook group and managed to contact someone who had been there twice. He told us the school was pretty large, with 3 floors and a basement that had been completely destroyed by flooding and exposure. He mentioned that the basement still had a stage where kids used to perform plays and musicals. He even said he'd found some old costumes, but warned us about the black mold and asbestos. We parked in a large parking lot behind the school, which used to be a busy plaza but was now almost deserted, cracked with weeds growing everywhere. We walked toward the back fence that separated the playground from the lot. Most of the playground equipment was either broken, rusted, or missing. We made our way to a small opening in the fence near the swings, just big enough for us to squeeze through if we were careful. Kevin, standing at 6 feet 5 inches and weighing about 230 pounds, knew he wouldn't fit through, so he volunteered to stay behind. We needed someone to keep an eye on the car and watch out for cops or any unwanted visitors. Jamie, however, chickened out because of the weather and decided to stay with Kevin, so they both stayed behind. Ty, Vin, and I squeezed through the fence and headed across the playground toward the school's back doors. On the way, I noticed a no trespassing sign just a few feet from the fence, but quickly shrugged it off. There used to be a chain on the double doors that prevented entry, but someone had cut it a while ago, and it now lay coiled up and rusted off to the side. Now I'm going to talk about the weather that night because I think it adds a lot to the story. It was in the high 80s, but it felt much higher due to the humidity. In the distance, I remember there were large storm clouds, so I knew we had to hurry with the exploration. Vin had brought a camera with him, and Ty was recording with his cell phone and had a flashlight app open. We never ended up needing the flashlight because enough light was trickling in through the broken ceiling and busted windows. As we entered, the door opened with almost no noise, but the floor was covered with pieces of broken ceiling, paint chips, trash, and dust. The air smelled very wet and musty. The temperature inside felt much hotter and more humid, but we just wiped our foreheads and held our water bottles in our hands. We looked around the floor, which was the ground floor, for about 15 minutes before we decided to move to the second floor. Ty suggested the basement, but the Facebook guy's description and the condition of the staircase changed all of our minds. Vin led the way, followed by me and Ty at the rear. The stairs were covered in debris, so our steps made very loud crunching noises all the way up the staircase. Keep this in mind, we had gone on these explorations many times and had never ran into anyone, except a very nice homeless woman and her dog many years ago who told us to stay off drugs. You could say we were overconfident and had our guard down. We reached the second floor, which had many more classrooms than the bottom floor. Many of the rooms were completely trashed, either due to the weather or vandals who had come in. The desks laid all over the floor, either broken or knocked over. Most of the windows were boarded up or broken, and graffiti covered almost every inch of the building that we had seen. However, some rooms were spared, and looked as if the students who once sat in them had just vanished into thin air while nature slowly took the building. Many of the desks still had supplies in them, the coat hooks still had coats on them, and the chalkboard still had writing on it. Ty even found a desk plate with a teacher's name on it. It read Miss Johnson after we wiped away the dust. I eventually found a folder in one of the desks that belonged to a kid named Kiana. I gathered that she was a girl who was in 4th grade and even saw a date on one of our old assignments that indicated it was from February of 1999. Many of the rooms that were in better shape had things like this, so we eventually got bored and decided it was time to move on. As we approached the staircase to the 3rd floor, I had a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. The kind of feeling you get when you think someone is about to jump out and scare you any minute. I told Ty and Vin about it, and Ty told me not to be a wimp and to just keep moving because he was starting to hear thunder in the distance. I noticed that it was starting to get cooler in the building, and it was much easier to breathe as we walked up to the 3rd floor. It was here where we would run into a strange and frightening situation. I noticed that the 3rd floor of the school was different from any other floor. The floor had much more trash on it, trash that appeared to be fairly recent. A lot of the old furniture was put in the back part of the first hallway we had turned into and piled very high. Then, Ty said something that, for whatever reason, gave me a cold chill up my spine. He noticed that the floor was not nearly as dusty and had fresher footprints than any we had seen earlier. We walked for a few more minutes, and I could tell that we were very nervous about running into someone. Just before we reached a hallway with a lot of classrooms, I decided to text Kevin to see if there was any strange activity outside. He replied within 10 seconds and said that it looked normal, but that it was going to rain any second. I told him to stay focused and message me if anything odd happened. We looked through many of the old rooms and found nothing but trash, old furniture, and rubble. One of the rooms Vin had walked into had half of its floor caved in. He was lucky that he saw it when he did. A few more minutes went by and I heard Ty say, "Dude, check this out." Me and Vin walked over to him and saw that he was holding a bag full of old used syringes. The needles looked very old and the plastic Ziploc bag holding them was torn and tattered. I told him to drop the bag before he got hepatitis or something. We all sort of chuckled and continued to walk down the hall toward the furniture pile. We noticed that behind this pile was a staircase that was completely filled with old shelves, chairs, and tables. To our right was a large room that was relatively clear but had mattresses scattered about. There were a lot of cigarette butts laying on the floor and an old rusted oil drum was in the middle of the room. Vin said that the room used to be a library because of a small plaque he had seen above the doorway. It made sense to me why there were so many shelves and chairs piled up right outside. As we got closer to the far end of the room, we examined the mattresses. There were about 5 of them, and they were all very dirty and torn up. Some had disgusting-looking stains and had horrible body odor smells to them. Vin noticed a small stack of dirty magazines by a bed on the farthest side of the room. We all got a giggle out of it. The room had 2 large windows parallel to each other, but they were boarded up and allowed almost no light into the room. As we got to the back of the room, we heard the sound of music being played. All of us froze in unison as the door swung open. There was a man at the entrance of the door. The look on his face told us that he was not happy that we were there. He was average height, had a shaved head, and a short, scruffy beard. He wore a faded brown shirt and some old white basketball shorts. His shoes were white at some point, but now they had a stained brown look to them. He was a white man. His whole body was covered in a thick layer of dirt. I will never forget his eyes. They were a very pale blue and looked like the eyes of a wolf. However, at the same time, I noticed the man behind him who gave me chills. The man never once stood up, remaining seated on a lawn chair with his left shoulder turned towards us. He looked over at us, his bright pink hair tied in a ponytail. His appearance was unsettling. His skin was tight and pale, and his eyes bulged slightly, making his already creepy expression even worse. He was very thin, and I noticed right away that he didn't seem to have any teeth at all. He wore a white t-shirt and black shorts, but didn't speak a single word to us. The man by the door, however, spoke in a rough, direct voice, asking what we were doing in the building and whether we were cops. Ty was the first to respond, explaining that we were just documenting the old, historical buildings in the area and had no intention of bothering anyone. The man seemed to relax a little and asked how long we planned to stay. I quickly jumped in and said we were almost done and needed to head out before the weather turned bad. He lit a cigarette and offered us one, but we all declined. He then suggested giving us a tour of the building, but we all, in unison, politely declined. His demeanor shifted immediately, and an angry, almost offended look crossed his face, as though our refusal had upset him. After a moment, he let out a chuckle and said, "Okay." He introduced himself as Walter and mentioned that the pink-haired man was named Ronnie. To our surprise, Walter cupped his hands and called out loudly for someone named Marty. There was no answer, and Walter casually remarked that Marty must have gone to do his business somewhere. As we stood there talking, I took out my phone and saw that Kevin had messaged me multiple times. The messages warned that a man had walked into the building just a minute ago, and we needed to get out of there immediately. The man, Walter, then asked how many of us there were in total. I lied, telling him there were 7 of us, because by this point, I was starting to panic, my stomach tightening with a deep sense of dread. Something about these guys just felt wrong. I had a strong gut feeling that they were dangerous. Vin and Ty clearly felt the same way. both wearing worried expressions. Meanwhile, the radio kept playing, but Walter ordered Marty to turn it off, complaining that it was giving him a headache. As he did, two things caught my attention. First, he had mentioned that the pink-haired guy was Ronnie, not Marty. And second, as Ronnie, or whoever it was, reached to turn off the radio, I noticed a bungee cord wrapped around his arm with a syringe in it. I didn't think Walter had noticed any of this, but before I could process it, another man walked into the room. This guy was by far the weirdest and most unsettling of the group. He was fairly short and had medium-length Bieber-style dark hair. His clothes looked much newer, but far too big for him. He had a blue Milwaukee Brewers t-shirt tucked into his oversized red sweatpants. His face looked sharp and leathery, but he appeared to have some sort of skin condition. His eyes were a beady black color and wide open. Parts of his face were a very bright pink, and he had a large amount of bumps on the lower corner of his bottom lip. He spoke in a more high-pitched rural accent. The other two men remained where they had been, Walter in the doorway and Marty or Ronnie in his chair. The new man said that his name was George and that he was very interested in Vin's camera. He asked what kind it was, where Vin got it, how much it cost, and why he had it. Vin explained that his hobby was filming videos and that he would often photograph at weddings and other events. This was all true, and the man immediately perked up and smiled. The kind of smile that gives you an uneasy feeling in your gut. The best way to describe it would be how the Grinch smiled in the old animated movie. As creepy as that was, this is when it gets really creepy. He asks Vin if he has ever recorded any little girls' beauty pageants or stuff along that line. Vin told him no, and the man genuinely looked disappointed. He went on to say some more creepy stuff about how hot the girls in these pageants were, and that he would die to be able to be alone with them. Our faces told the story of how we felt hearing this, but the man seemed oblivious. He asked us all if we had any kids of our own. Ty slipped up and told him that he had two twin girls who were 2 years old. The man giggled in a very creepy and cringy way. He then asked Ty if he ever left the girls alone by themselves, or if he had a babysitter. Ty told them that he and his fiancée watched the kids the majority of the time, but would occasionally have his aunt babysit them if they could not. George asked Ty if he had any photos of the girls. Ty showed him a few on his phone, and the man asked a very strange question. He asked if he would allow his daughter to date a guy like him. By this point, I'm sure Ty wanted to drop this creep, but he also knew that the other two were behind us and could possibly have knives or something else. So instead, he said he would have to get to know him more. The man giggled again and said that he could get to know them when he babysat them. The tone of his voice still gives me chills. It was said in such a slow, seductive type of way that left little doubt as to what this guy was. I saw Ty's brow drop and knew that he was getting pretty upset. I took my phone out and texted Kevin to honk his horn a bunch of times. As I did this, the creepy weirdo stepped toward me and asked me who I was messaging. He was close enough for me to smell his bourbon breath. I leaned back slightly and told him we needed to leave soon before the weather got really bad. Walter spoke again and said that we might as well stay since the storm would begin any moment, and he didn't want us to get wet. Vin explained that we had two friends waiting in a car for us outside. Just as he said that we could hear a car horn blaring outside. Both the creep and the bald man showed no reaction to what happened and insisted that we stay and invite our friends in. We all stood there and explained that we had to leave, and eventually they agreed. Nonetheless, George insisted that he walk us out, and so we walked and got to the ground floor. As we crossed the floor, we could hear this creepy man muttering to himself and giggle every now and then. We stepped outside and the weather was much cooler. The air smelled of ozone and there was a static feeling in the air as small droplets of rain hit my face. George walked us over to the area of the fence we had entered. Ty slipped out first, followed quickly by Vin. They both stumbled down the steep hill and were waiting for me to go. As I tried to go through the fence, George pushed it against my chest. I was on edge, but it still caught me off guard. I gasped, and he leaned in real close. The smell of bourbon made me turn my head slightly. I will never forget what he said to me in a very quick burst. I know you know what I am. It doesn't matter because I like it. You're lucky that fine girl was in the car with that fat guy, or I would have done whatever I wanted to her. As he said whatever, he said it much slower, seductively, and emphasized like he had earlier, and licked his lips slowly at the end of the sentence. His beady eyes widened as he let go of the fence. I quickly slipped through and tumbled down to the concrete. I was totally fine, but I looked up to the creepy psycho. Ty, Vin, Kevin, and Jamie were all there to help me up. They all looked up at the man in shock, and Ty hurled an insult at him. George slowly rose up and looked at Ty through the fence. He put his tongue on the chain link fence and made a licking motion. He winked, giggled, and flashed a grin that reminded me of the Grinch, before saying his final words to us. "For your girls," he said, pointing directly at Ty. It took every ounce of restraint to stop Ty from charging at him. But eventually, we lost sight of George, and after some effort, we managed to calm Ty down. We sat in the car, our adrenaline slowly fading, leaving us exhausted. We told Kevin and Jamie everything we had seen, heard, and felt. It was in that car ride home that we decided, unanimously, that it would be our last urban exploration. We all agreed it was too close of a call. As I sat in the car, my mind kept racing back to each of the men we had encountered. Who exactly were they? It was clear they were some kind of addicts, but something didn't feel right about any of them. The pink-haired man said nothing and was almost like a ghost. The bald man spoke little, but his wolf-like eyes said a lot. And the creepy man couldn't stop talking. A few weeks later, I decided to try and track these guys down on a website that posted mugshots of people with criminal records. I couldn't find anything until one day, Vin sent me a link to a sex offender registry website. My heart nearly stopped when I saw the photo. It was the man who called himself George. He looked much younger, and his hair was shorter, but it was undeniably him. He still had that same creepy smile. But his real name? Charles Earl Daly. He was listed as a wanted sex offender from Arkansas, considered a very high-risk offender and possibly armed. Reading about his crimes made my stomach turn, and I was furious that it took us so long to find any information about him. But I was amazed that Vin had found something at all. I eventually reported the encounter to the police, but nothing came of it. The old school had been torn down months ago, and I had no idea. Life has gone back to normal since then. Our group still gets together, reminiscing about our urban exploration days. But the one question we always come back to is, whatever happened to those men? Where is Charles Earl Daly? Who wasn't lucky enough to escape from these guys? Just thinking about the danger we were in sends a cold, cold shiver down my spine. I've always followed the rule of not stopping for hitchhikers. It's something I set for myself early in my career as a long-haul trucker, and I've stuck to it for years. Not because I'm heartless or unwilling to help, but because you hear too many unsettling stories out on the road. Stories that make you second-guess picking up a stranger. So when I saw the figure standing on the side of the highway that night, thumb raised, every instinct told me to keep driving. But something felt different this time. It was late, around 2 a.m., and the highway was nearly deserted. The only light came from the moon hanging low in the sky and the occasional flicker of my headlights reflecting off the roadside signs. I'd been driving for hours, and the sound of the engine had settled into a comforting rhythm. That's when I saw him, a man, standing by the shoulder of the road, alone. His thumb outstretched in that universal gesture of please stop. At first, I thought I was imagining it. You don't usually see hitchhikers this far out in the middle of nowhere, especially not at this hour. But as I got closer, there was no mistaking it. He was real, tall, dressed in what looked like an old, tattered jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He didn't seem desperate or panicked. He was just standing there, like he'd been waiting for something or someone. For a moment, I debated with myself. I'd always sworn I wouldn't stop, but something about the guy gnawed at me. What if he was stranded? What if he really needed help? Maybe his car had broken down, and this stretch of highway wasn't exactly busy at night. Against my better judgment, I found myself easing off the gas, slowing the rig until I came to a stop just a few yards ahead of him. "Are you seriously stopping?" I muttered under my breath, shaking my head. I didn't even know why I was doing this, but something had pulled me in. I glanced in the rearview mirror as the man jogged toward the truck. His movements were almost too fast, as if he'd been standing out there for much longer than I realized. My hand hovered over the door lock for a moment before I pressed it, hearing the faint click as it unlocked. He opened the passenger door and climbed in without a word. The cab immediately felt smaller with him inside, his presence somehow taking up more space than I had expected. He settled into the seat, pulling the door shut with a soft thud. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice low and gravelly, almost like he hadn't spoken in a long time. His face was still partially hidden by the cap, and up close, his jacket looked even more worn, frayed at the edges, like it had seen better days. "No problem," I replied, trying to sound casual even though my gut was tying itself in knots. "Where you headed?" "Just up the road a bit," he said, not offering any specifics. His answer was vague, and something about it made me uneasy. But I'd already let him in, and there wasn't much I could do about it now. I pressed down on the gas, and the truck rumbled back to life, rolling down the empty highway. The cab fell into an awkward silence, with only the of the engine and the faint sound of the tires on the asphalt filling the space. I kept my eyes on the road, resisting the urge to glance at him too often. He hadn't said much after climbing in, just staring straight ahead, like he wasn't interested in conversation. After a few minutes, I decided to break the silence. "So, you from around here?" "No," he answered, his voice flat, "just passing through." I nodded, not pushing for more. He clearly wasn't in the mood to chat, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to know much more about him. The miles stretched on, and the longer we drove, the more the unease in my gut grew. It wasn't just the man's silence that was getting to me. It was the way he sat, perfectly still, not fidgeting or moving like most people would. He kept his hands folded in his lap, his face hidden in the shadows from the brim of his cap, almost like he was trying not to be seen too clearly. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "So, how'd you end up out here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Just when I thought he might ignore me entirely, he spoke. His voice quieter now. "Got stuck. Needed a lift?" I frowned. "Stuck where?" He didn't answer this time, just kept staring ahead, his eyes fixed on the road like he was lost in thought. A cold shiver crept down my spine, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. We passed a mile marker, and I glanced over at him again, hoping he'd give me some indication of where he wanted to be dropped off. But he didn't say anything. His gaze remained locked on the dark highway, like he was waiting for something. My heart started to race. I'd been on the road long enough to know when things didn't feel right, and everything about the situation was setting off alarm bells in my head. "I should be able to drop you off at the next rest stop," I said, my voice a little too loud in the quiet cab. "Shouldn't be too far from here." "No," he said, his voice sharper this time. "I'm not stopping there." A chill ran through me. His tone had changed, and there was an edge to it that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I forced a laugh, trying to keep things light. "Well, it's the only stop for a while, so I'm afraid that's where I'm headed." For the first time, he turned his head to look at me. I could feel his eyes on me, though I still couldn't see his face clearly under the brim of his cap. But there was something in the way he stared, something that made my stomach twist. I said, "I'm not stopping there." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and suddenly the quiet cab felt suffocating. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't know who this guy was or what he wanted, but I knew I didn't want him in my truck any longer. I swallowed hard, keeping my voice steady. "Look, man, I'm just trying to help you out. If you don't want to stop, that's fine. But this is as far as I can take you." Silence again. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of the tires on the road. And then, without warning, he reached up and tugged the brim of his cap lower over his face. "Fine," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Just drop me off at the next mile marker." I nodded, my heart still hammering in my chest, and kept my eyes glued to the road. A few miles passed in intense silence. When I finally spotted the next mile marker, I eased the truck over to the shoulder, bringing it to a stop. "Here you go," I said, trying to sound casual. "Hope you find your way." The man didn't respond. He opened the door and stepped out into the night, closing it softly behind him. I watched in the rearview mirror as he lingered for a moment, staring up at the sky before disappearing into the darkness. I didn't wait around to see where he went. As soon as the door clicked shut, I pressed down on the gas and got the hell out of there. My heart was pounding the entire way. It wasn't until I reached the next truck stop that I finally allowed myself to relax. I pulled into the lot, turned off the engine, and sat there for a long time, my hands still clutching the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I never saw the man again, and to this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted. But I do know one thing: I'll never pick up another hitchhiker, no matter how stranded they seem. I was about 17 when this happened. I was in junior college and had rented a small apartment in a standalone building. The building was situated right behind a construction site, so there weren't many people around, especially at night. For context, I was living with another girl, let's call her Nancy, who was also in school. One day, I was invited to a friend's birthday party. About 12 people attended that evening. I didn't think I'd be out too late, so I wasn't worried about not having a place to stay if things went wrong. However, things didn't go as planned. Being young and a bit careless, I ended up staying late at the party, giving in to my friend's insistence. That meant I'd have to head home on my own since my friend's apartment was tiny, and she already had 5 other people staying there that night. Not wanting to go back alone, I invited 2 of my friends, Sandra and Katia, to stay over. Our Uber dropped us off in front of the construction site, since the road conditions were bad, and the workers had left piles of concrete blocking the way. We had no choice but to cross the site to reach my building. I remember Sandra mentioning that she was feeling uneasy and wished she had brought her pepper spray. I tried to act tough, but I was also a bit scared. Katia, on the other hand, was totally relaxed, and we just followed her lead. As we made our way through the construction site, something caught our attention. We saw a strange, flickering light coming from beneath one of the construction buildings. It was eerie and unsettling. It was really odd, as there was no chance that it was a construction worker at 2:30 a.m. in the middle of the night. Before we had time to register what was going on, we heard something that made our hearts stop for a moment. It was a shrill, frantic cry of a woman coming from the same building. Judging by the sound of her voice, she was in excruciating pain. What happened next gives me nightmares to this day. We saw someone falling from the building literally meters away from us, causing an earth-shattering thud. Sandra almost yelled in terror, but Katia was able to quickly grab her mouth to make the sound fade. Thinking on her feet, she grabbed us both by the arm and pulled us behind a half-constructed wall of another building. Just to be sure that no one could see us, we stayed behind this wall for what seemed like forever. Suddenly, we saw someone wearing a bright yellow jacket exiting the building with a gas cutter in his right hand and an amputated arm in the left. We couldn't see his face because the place was not well lit and it was almost pitch black there. Honestly, considering the absolute horror that we were in, that was the last thing that would cross our minds. After another eternity of making sure that we were now safe, we made it back home, still trembling with fear. We called 911, the police came and investigated. After a few days, we learned that it was a homeless woman who was murdered brutally that night. Her arm was cut off with a gas lighter, and she was pushed out of the 5th story and left to bleed and die. However, to this day, after several failed attempts, investigators have no clue as to who the murderer was. There's a weird sort of calm that comes over you when you're driving alone at night. It's just you, the empty road, and the hum of your tires against the asphalt. It's peaceful in a way until it isn't, until something makes you realize just how isolated you really are. That's what happened to me one night when I pulled into a rest stop in the middle of nowhere, thinking I'd catch a quick break. I wasn't expecting to meet anyone, certainly not him. I'd been driving for hours, trying to make it back home after a weekend away. It was late, well past midnight, and the road had been empty for miles. No cars, no lights, just the occasional reflective road sign flashing past. I could feel the exhaustion creeping up on me. So when I saw a sign for a rest stop ahead, I figured it was a good chance to stretch my legs and maybe grab a quick nap before getting back on the road. The rest stop was nothing special, just a small lot with a couple of vending machines and a bathroom. The kind of place you stop at when there's nothing else around, but you're too tired to keep going. I pulled in, parked under one of the dim street lights, and cut the engine. The light flickered overhead, casting a pale glow over the empty lot. As soon as I stepped out of the car, the cold air hit me. It was that sharp, biting kind of cold you get when you're deep in the middle of nowhere. I wrapped my jacket tighter around me and headed toward the vending machines, hoping to grab a soda or something to keep me awake for the next leg of the trip. That's when I saw him. First, I thought I was alone, but as I approached the vending machines, I noticed a figure standing just at the edge of the light, leaning against the wall by the bathrooms. He was tall, with his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a long, dark coat. The hood of the coat was pulled up, obscuring most of his face, but I could tell he was watching me. I stopped in my tracks. My heart skipped a beat. Something about the way he stood, so still and so silent, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there, staring. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. It was late and I was tired. Maybe he was just another traveler, waiting for someone, taking a break like I was. But there was something about his presence that felt off. I fumbled for my wallet, trying to focus on the vending machine, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. My fingers trembled slightly as I fed a few bills into the machine and pressed the button for a soda. The can clattered down into the tray, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. I grabbed the can and turned to leave, hoping to make it back to my car without any kind of interaction. But as soon as I took a step, the man spoke. Long night. His voice was low, raspy, and sent a shiver down my spine. I stopped, glancing over at him, unsure if I should respond. He hadn't moved from his spot, still leaning against the wall, his face mostly hidden in shadow.
Yeah,
I said, forcing a small smile, trying to keep my voice casual, just passing through. He didn't respond right away, just kept staring. The silence between us stretched out, thick and uncomfortable, until finally he spoke again. Where are you headed? Something about the question made me pause. It wasn't just the question itself, it was the way he asked it. Like, he already knew the answer and was just waiting for me to confirm it. Home, I said, keeping my response short, my nerves on edge. Again, he didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood there watching me. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could feel his eyes on me, sharp and unsettling. The whole situation felt wrong, like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't quite understand. You shouldn't stop here, he said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. Not tonight. My heart skipped a beat. What? This place? He said, his head tilting slightly as if he were listening to something only he could hear. It's not safe. Not for people like you. A cold chill ran down my spine. People like me. What did that mean? I took a step back, my pulse quickening. I'm just passing through. I repeated, trying to sound calm, though my hands were shaking now. I'll be gone in a minute. You should leave now, he said, his voice a little sharper this time. Before it gets dark. I stared at him, confused. It was already dark, and had been for hours. What was he talking about? Look, I said, backing toward my car. I'm just trying to get home. For the first time, the man moved, stepping out of the shadow and into the pale light of the flickering street lamp. I finally got a good look at his face, and what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. His skin was pale, almost sickly, with deep shadows under his eyes. But it wasn't just that. There was something off about his expression, like he was seeing something that wasn't there. His eyes were too wide, too focused, as if he were waiting for something to happen. Get in your car, he said, his voice low and urgent. Drive. Now. I didn't need to be told again. My heart was pounding as I scrambled back to my car, fumbling with my keys in my haste to unlock the door. I glanced back at the man one last time as I climbed into the driver's seat, but he was already gone, vanished into the shadows like he'd never been there at all. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the rest stop, tires kicking up gravel as I sped back onto the highway. For the first few miles, I couldn't stop checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man standing in the middle of the road behind me. But the highway was empty, just an endless stretch of darkness and the distant glow of the moon. I drove for what felt like hours, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was that man? And what had he meant when he said it wasn't safe? I still don't know. But here's the thing. About an hour after I left that rest stop, I heard about an accident on the same stretch of highway. A car had lost control and crashed into the trees near the rest stop I'd been at. The driver didn't make it. They said he'd likely fallen asleep at the wheel, exhausted from a long drive. And ever since then, I've wondered, if I hadn't stopped, if I hadn't met that strange man who told me to leave, would that have been me? I don't know who he was or how he knew, but I've never stopped at a rest stop like that again, and I don't think I ever will. You know that sensation when something just feels off, like an unsettling weight in the pit of your stomach, even though everything around you seems perfectly fine? That's exactly what hit me when we first stepped onto that trail. It was supposed to be an easy hike, a simple back and forth through a well-known park. But that day, the woods felt different. And by the time I realized something was terribly wrong, it was already too late. I'd been hiking with my best friend, Lucas Mia, for years. It was our tradition, getting away from the noise of the city, finding peace in nature's quiet. We'd hiked everywhere, from thick forests to towering mountain ranges. But this time, we decided to keep it simple, sticking to a trail we both knew well, one we'd walked dozens of times before. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind where sunlight spills through the trees in golden beams, and the forest hums with the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just another routine hike. We parked at the trailhead, strapped on our boots, and hit the path. Our packs were light, only the essentials: water, snacks, a map. Not that we thought we'd need it. The first half of the hike was perfect. The trail was well-trodden, winding through the trees with the familiar crunch of dirt and leaves underfoot. We chatted about work, upcoming weekend plans, and the usual stuff. Lucas, being the faster hiker, was a little ahead of me, setting a pace that had me pushing to keep up. But I didn't mind. The exercise felt refreshing, and the woods always had a way of calming me down. But as we reached the halfway point, things began to change. It was subtle at first. The sunlight that had been pouring through the trees seemed to dull, as if a cloud had drifted in front of the sun, even though the sky had been clear when we started. The birds, once chirping all around us, suddenly stopped, and the usual sounds of the forest gave way to an eerie, unnatural stillness. I tried to brush it off at first, assuming I was just imagining things. But after another mile or so, the silence became too obvious to ignore. "Do you hear that?" I called to Lucas, who was a little ahead. He slowed and turned to give me a confused look. "Hear what?" he asked. "Exactly," I said, stopping in my tracks. "It's too quiet. Where are the birds? Where's the wind?" Lucas shrugged, though I could tell he was starting to feel it too. "I don't know. Maybe we're just in some weird part of the woods or something." But I wasn't convinced. We'd hiked this trail enough times to know that something was off. The air felt dense, heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. But we kept going. The trail was supposed to loop back around, bringing us back to the car in an hour or two. I figured we'd push through and be back at the trailhead soon enough. But as we continued, the trail began to change. The trees, once spaced out and familiar, began crowding in around us. Their branches twisted together, forming a canopy that blocked out much of the light. The dirt path grew narrower, more uneven, and before long, we found ourselves stepping over large roots and rocks that hadn't been there before. "Are you sure we're still on the trail?" I asked, my voice tight with unease. Lucas pulled out the map, glancing at it before looking around. I think so, he said. Though there was hesitation in his voice, the trail markers should be up ahead. But there weren't any markers. The further we went, the more the trail seemed to disappear, swallowed by the dense forest. The trees loomed over us, casting long shadows that made it hard to tell where the trail ended and the woods began. After what felt like an eternity, Lucas stopped, turning to face me with a frown. I think we should head back, he said, his voice low. This doesn't feel right. I nodded, relieved that he was finally admitting what I'd been feeling for the past hour. Yeah, let's go. We turned around and started retracing our steps. But something was wrong. The path we'd come down didn't look the same. The trees seemed closer together, the underbrush thicker, and the familiar landmarks we'd passed, like the fallen log near the creek, were nowhere to be seen. We didn't come this way, I muttered, my heart pounding in my chest. Did we? Lucas didn't answer right away, his eyes scanning the dense woods around us. I don't know, he said, his voice tight, but we'll figure it out. Let's just keep moving. We walked for what felt like hours, but the more we tried to backtrack, the more lost we became. The trail, which had been so clear and obvious when we started, had vanished completely, swallowed by the forest. The trees pressed in on us from all sides, and the silence was suffocating. Panic started to creep in. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, in the way my breath came faster and my steps grew quicker. Lucas, always the calm one, was starting to show signs of frustration too. He kept checking the map, even though it was useless now. Nothing around us matched what was on the page. At one point, we came to a small clearing, a patch of open ground surrounded by trees so thick. It was like a wall of wood and leaves. I glanced at Lucas, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. We're going in circles, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to believe it, but he was right. The same clearing we'd stumbled into earlier was now in front of us again, even though we'd been walking in a straight line for what felt like miles. This doesn't make any sense, I said, my voice shaking. We should have been out of here by now. Lucas didn't say anything. He just stared at the ground, his jaw clenched, as if trying to figure out what to do next. We need to stay calm, he said, finally, though I could hear the strain in his voice. We'll find our way out. We just need to. Before he could finish, something moved in the trees. It was just a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, my heart racing, but whatever it was had already disappeared. Did you see that? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Lucas shook his head. See what? There's something out there, I said, my throat dry. I saw something move. Lucas scanned the trees, but the woods remained still, the shadows stretching deep and long. You're just spooked, he said, though his tone didn't sound entirely sure. There's nothing out there, but I knew what I had seen. Something or someone was watching us. We stood frozen for a long while, both of us tense, waiting for something to happen. But the forest stayed quiet, the trees unmoving. Eventually, Lucas broke the silence. Let's keep moving, he said, his voice steady. We'll find the trail again. We have to. I wanted to trust him, but deep down, I knew the truth. We were lost, and the woods weren't offering any hints about how to escape. We walked for what felt like hours, maybe even longer. The sky, once clear and bright, had turned a heavy, oppressive gray. The sun was dipping lower, casting long, twisted shadows as we pushed through the trees. But the trail never resurfaced. As the night crept in, Lucas and I faced a choice we never wanted to make. We would have to camp here, in the middle of nowhere. We found a flat spot on the ground, set up our tent, and tried to tell ourselves that everything would be fine in the morning. But as the darkness enveloped us, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We never made it back to the car. The next day, a search party found Lucas' gear, neatly packed at the trailhead. But me, I never returned. This happened about 3 years ago while I was staying in a rental house during a trip to visit my brother. He lives 6 hours away from me, so I don't get to see him often, and since he only has a one-bedroom apartment, I usually have to stay somewhere else when I do visit. The house I rented was really close to his apartment and priced similarly to the nearby hotels, so it was an easy choice. I arrived in town early in the morning, met up with my brother for lunch, grabbed some groceries, and was back at the rental around 5 p.m. The house didn't offer much, just a couch, a TV, and a bed, but for the price, I wasn't expecting much more. I stayed up until 9 p.m. and then went to bed. It had been a long day, so I was eager to get some good rest. However, I lay in bed longer than I wanted, finally falling asleep after about an hour. When I woke up, the room was completely dark, and I could tell it was the middle of the night. Before I even checked the time, I heard something outside the room. It sounded like footsteps slowly walking down the hallway, followed by a door softly closing, then silence. My body froze, and I just lay there in the dark, staring at the room. After a minute of no more sounds, I got up and checked the hallway. At the far end, I saw the front door, which I knew was the one I had heard closing, but I couldn't tell if someone was still in the house or if they had left. I quietly walked through the other rooms but didn't see anyone. The only thing that gave any clue that someone had been there was the front door being unlocked. I didn't notice any footprints or missing items. After checking that all the doors were locked, I called 911. They arrived quickly but didn't do much. They told me to make sure all the doors were locked and to contact the owner of the rental. Their advice felt useless, and they showed no real interest in investigating further. I stayed up that night, unable to sleep, and waited until morning. After talking to the owner about what had happened, I went to see my brother. While I was out, the owner updated me that they had changed the PIN code for the door, which made me feel a little better. I was out until late that evening, having dinner and drinks with my brother. I was dropped off back at the rental sometime between 8 and 9 p.m. I went to the couch, feeling tired, but that same sense of nervousness from the night before lingered. Every time my eyes were about to close, my head would be filled with fear of the intruder coming back. Knowing I needed to sleep tonight since I didn't get any last night, I decided to go through the house again and check the rooms in hopes to ease my mind. I walked around the living room and kitchen, then went down the hallway to the bedroom. I opened the closet and checked the attached bathroom, and just before I walked out, I heard footsteps running through the hallway toward the bedroom I was in. I swung around the corner and only caught a glimpse of a large man as he slammed the bedroom door shut. Then I heard his footsteps departing and going toward the living room, while I stood in place and just listened. He went all around the living room and kitchen, staying inside the house for probably 2 minutes before I heard the front door open and close behind him. Police came quickly after I called again, and this time, the homeowner came by as well. The living room and kitchen looked like they'd been ransacked. The furniture was scattered all over, and the cabinets were all open with the things inside them having been tossed over the floor. After a closer look, though, the owner didn't see anything that was missing. It looked more like whoever that man was looking for something very specific and nothing more. I left the rental and got a hotel after that, and within a few days I was never updated again about anything. I assume he was never found, but the situation has left me with a lot of questions. Something that really gets to me is that I had checked the entire house that one night. So where was he hiding? How long had he been in the house with me? Was he watching me? And what would have happened if I had fallen asleep on the couch? When I was about 12, I stayed at my friend's house one night. He lived in a big, old house out in the country with no neighbors around, so it was pretty isolated. We were playing some Nintendo 64 one evening when his mom and sister left to go to the store to pick up a movie, leaving just the two of us at home. Not long after they left, we heard a loud slam from his sister's room, so hard that a few picture frames fell off the wall. We looked at each other and laughed, thinking his sister must have stayed home and gotten mad about something. We didn't think much of it, so time passed, and we decided to head downstairs to grab something to eat. As we walked down, we noticed that his sister's room light was on, and we could hear the TV playing. We grabbed some cereal and sat down in the kitchen, and just as we were about to start eating, we heard his mom's car pull into the driveway. Next thing we know, his mom and sister walk in. We looked at each other and said, "We thought you stayed home," and told them about the door slamming and the lights and TV being on. We went upstairs to check her room, but the door was locked and the light and TV were still on. We unlocked the door, only to find that her room was completely empty. That's when we started to feel like something was off. Over the next few months, strange things kept happening. Random noises, objects being moved around, and things turning up in odd places. But one night, his dad, who worked nights, had gone to work, leaving his mom alone with the kids. She was lying on the couch covered by a blanket when suddenly, something wrapped the blanket around her and dragged it into the basement, without anyone opening the door, just pulling it through the crack at the bottom. Before she could even react, she heard her daughter scream and rushed upstairs. When she opened the door to her daughter's room, she found her sitting up in bed, and the bed was now in the middle of the room. All the pictures on one wall had been ripped off. She grabbed both kids and left the house, telling her husband she would never return. She never did, not even to help pack up or move anything. Years later, I was like 19 or something, and my friend and I were drinking and sitting around a fire when people started telling creepy stories. We looked at each other and told them about what happened at his house, which neither of us really ever talked about it. The house was actually now abandoned, and as soon as we said where it was, of course, everyone wanted to go. So the five of us drive out to the house in the middle of the night, and we find a way in. The house is pretty much empty and actually not in that bad of shape. The paint started to peel and has that old empty house feel. We go through the whole house and three of us are in the basement, which is all cement and has 2 rooms divided by an open doorway. We're about to go back upstairs when our buddy finishes his bottle of beer and he throws it into the other room, but it never makes a sound. Well, that was enough for us to leave. While I didn't have much happen while Ma was at their house, this was like my second family, and they never talked about that house or what happened. If it was ever brought up in front of his mom, the subject would quickly change or she would just walk away. On August 18, 2016, I set out on a trip along the Allagash Waterway with my Boy Scout troop. We were based in Hampton, Maine, a fair distance south of the waterway. Our journey began at a small brook that fed into Eagle Lake. It was my first time on the Allagash, and as the only rookie in the group, I was paired with Connor, the most experienced and strongest paddler. Our canoe was usually in the middle of the group, which meant we had to keep a good pace, and I found my arms tiring quickly. On the banks of Eagle Lake, there were 2 steam engines, known as the ghost trains of Allagash. The real story behind them wasn't as mystical as it sounded. The Allagash had once been a busy waterway for logging. After logging ceased, the 2 locomotives were left to rust and decay. It was amazing to see the trains even in their dilapidated state. For almost an hour, we explored the rusted engines, carefully navigating the weak spots where erosion had done its work. Soon enough, we continued across the lake. After paddling for a while, we decided to line up our boats and motor across the remainder of the lake. Our canoes formed a large fiberglass snake, moving slowly but steadily. I even started to doze off, only to be jolted awake by a sudden stop. The boat in front of us had come to a halt, causing us to crash into it. The scout in the stern seat turned around, muttering a warning, and then splashed me with grimy lake water as he shook his paddle. We all resumed paddling, and before long we reached our first campsite. I set up the tent I would be sharing with my friend Aaron. Without waiting for dinner, I collapsed into the tent and fell asleep. The next morning, we were up early, 5:30 a.m., and I was packing away the tent. Aaron, who had argued with me the night before, was now sleeping on the wet grass outside. I skipped breakfast and began packing my canoe for the next leg of the trip. The day passed like any other, paddling along until we reached Chase Rapids. There, we unloaded our gear into a trailer and then rode down the rapids in our lighter canoes. After stopping for lunch, we continued downstream toward our next campsite. But that night, things took a strange turn. We sat on the banks of the river, watching shooting stars streak across the sky. The lack of light pollution revealed the true beauty of the night. Shades of purple, Pink and blue stretched across the sky, and millions of stars sparkled above. By nearly 10 o'clock, everyone retreated to their tents, and the sound of snoring filled the air. I stepped outside my tent, unsure if I should risk waking Aaron and dealing with his anger or just find a different tent to join. I turned, scanning for a tent big enough for 3 people, when something caught my eye. There was a star that appeared to be moving, not fast like a shooting star, but slowly and growing in size. I stood in shock as the star stopped, hovering almost directly above me. I reached up, expecting my hand to go through it, like a beam of light, but the star was solid and ice cold, as if I had just rolled out of a freezer. I could now see it was more of an oval shape glowing white. A large beam of light surrounded me, and I felt a strange tingling sensation in the back of my neck. I felt myself being lifted from the muddy ground, and I could feel my body being absorbed into the oval like a water in a sponge. I found myself in a dark room, and a thick mist filled my nostrils and mouth. It stung my eyes and lungs, and my entire body went numb quite quickly, and I blacked out. I awoke in a room that was completely white. It was entirely well lit, but I couldn't identify a light source. When I was around 10 or 11, my parents and I lived in a duplex house in Tennessee. It was a decent size, 3 bedrooms, a large backyard, and a nice front porch. I went to a good school and had plenty of friends on our block. I had many great times and happy memories in that house. However, there's one memory that still haunts me to this day, and it happened there. I always had a strange sensation in that house, like I was being watched, but no one was there. That eerie feeling you get when you're alone and you're convinced someone's watching you. It was especially bad when I was in my room, as I always felt like something was watching me from inside my closet. I've always been a self-aware person, so I thought it was just typical childhood fears. Stuff in the closet, something under the bed, that sort of thing. What I couldn't explain, though, was how often the lights would turn on and off by themselves, or how the TV would randomly turn on or off. My dad tried to rationalize it, saying it was the house's wiring or an electrical issue, but it never seemed to bother my parents. One afternoon after school, I followed my usual routine, snack, turn on Nickelodeon, and sit down on the floor to do my homework. About 10 minutes into it, I heard a noise coming from my parents' bedroom, like rustling. I knew they weren't home yet. It was still early in the afternoon, and their cars weren't in the driveway. I thought maybe it was an intruder, but I was just a skinny little kid at the time. Instead of going for help, I walked toward their bedroom. I could still hear the rustling noise, but I found it odd. If it was a burglar, why would they be in the bathroom? I reached the bedroom door, which was open. Before stepping inside, I called out, "Mom? Dad? Is that you?" I knew it couldn't be them, but that's just what I said. Then I heard it, a sound that I'll never forget, a hideous cackle, like a rotten snicker, followed by what I can only describe as an old woman's voice. It repeated my words, mocking me. "Mom? Dad? Is that you?" And then the cackling again. At that point, I thought I was dreaming, and tears started welling up in my eyes. I figured I was about to get a jump scare, so I walked toward the bathroom, bracing for the shock. But when I got there, I saw nothing. Nothing but bathroom items scattered all over the floor, some even in the sink. I turned to leave, but I tripped on the doorway and fell flat on my chest. Now I really thought I was dreaming, and I started crying, calling for my mom. I felt like I was on the floor for hours, but it was probably only a minute. I got up, looked behind me, still saw nothing, and ran to the living room to grab my homework. I went outside and sat on the porch, not daring to go back inside until one of my parents got home. When I told them what happened, they shrugged it off as a dream, said I probably dozed off while watching TV and had a vivid dream. Fine. But the thing is, I don't remember waking up that day. The day just seemed to continue on, then into the evening, and eventually the night where I likely didn't get much sleep. Nothing that extreme ever happened again in that house, and we ended up moving about a year later. I'm older now, but to this day, I still get uneasy being in bathrooms. Because if I ever heard that voice again, I don't know how I'd react. I'd probably have a heart attack. That voice was just that terrifying. I hated that house. A year ago, I experienced something that still gives me chills, but let me start at the beginning. A few years ago, I was just a normal 15-year-old girl living with my family in a large old house in Switzerland. At that time, I began dating a girl who lived on the same street as me. We spent more and more time at my house together, and eventually, she moved in with us about a year later. My parents lived on the ground floor, while my girlfriend, my sister, and I lived on the middle floor, and the top floor remained empty. I never really felt uncomfortable in the house, but things slowly started to change after my girlfriend moved in. She was a little paranoid, which I could understand. Even though the house had been renovated, it was still an old wooden house, and old houses make strange noises. You know the kind: wind howling through the attic, rain draining through the gutters, and the wooden beams cracking when they stretch as it warms up. My girlfriend wasn't used to noises like that since she had lived in a very modern, quiet apartment. Sometimes, she would shake me awake in the middle of the night because she heard footsteps or other noises, usually coming from the floor above us where the guest rooms were. I'd always calm her down by saying, "It's just the house, or the beams cracking, or our cats playing." But it wasn't just that. Even after years of living there, she was still scared to be alone in the house, like a little kid. I could kind of understand that too. It's intimidating to be alone in a big old house when you're used to a modern apartment. But over time, I began to feel a little paranoid as well. It's really strange to be home alone or to go to the upper floor by yourself when someone keeps saying there's something or someone up there. I started to hear noises too. Not in the same way, but I began questioning, was that just the cats? Or the wind in the attic? Gradually, I became uncomfortable in my own house. To be fair, I didn't think much of it until one evening that completely changed everything. It was a warm summer evening last year. My older brother and his wife had organized a family barbecue, and my parents decided to stay with my brother for the night. We, however, wanted to go back to our house, so we did. I drove home with my girlfriend, my sister, and her boyfriend. It was late, about 3 a.m., when we arrived. As we pulled into the driveway, my sister mentioned that there was a light on in the upper floor. I figured maybe we had forgotten to turn off the light on our floor, but my girlfriend insisted that it was definitely the upper floor. We got out of the car, looked at the house, and sure enough, we saw the light on in the upper floor. The problem was, the light switch for that floor was up there, so none of us had been up there, and we couldn't have turned the light on by accident. I started to walk to the door, but my girlfriend grabbed my hand and yanked me back roughly. She lifted her arm, pointing toward the big window on the upper floor. We froze, unable to move when we saw someone standing in the window. The figure slowly moved toward the window, and then it stared directly at us. For what felt like forever, we just stood there, our bodies filled with pure terror. Then the light suddenly went out. In a panic, we jumped into the car and sped off as fast as we could. We all saw the same thing, a figure standing in the window staring at us. The only time we went back to that house after that was to gather our things and visit my parents. We never went back up to that floor or spent the night there again, and for that, I am incredibly grateful. The gentle rocking of a cruise ship can lull you into a false sense of safety. But when you witness a murder at sea, that soothing sway turns into the heartbeat of a nightmare you can't escape. I had always dreamed of taking a Caribbean cruise. The idea of sailing through turquoise waters, visiting exotic islands, and indulging in unlimited food and entertainment seemed like the perfect way to escape my mundane office job. When I finally booked my trip aboard the Majestic Seas, a luxurious liner promising the ultimate vacation, I was beyond thrilled. The first few days were everything I had imagined and more. I lounged by the pool, sipping brightly colored cocktails and chatting with fellow passengers. I tried my luck at the casino, watched dazzling performances at night, and ate more than I thought was possible. felt like paradise. On the fourth night of the cruise, I decided to take a late-night walk on the deck. The air was warm and salty, and the moon painted a silver path across the dark ocean. Most passengers were either asleep or enjoying the nightclub, leaving the deck eerily quiet. As I rounded a corner toward the ship's bow, I heard raised voices coming from one of the smaller lounges. My curiosity got the better of me, and I slowed my pace, straining to listen. "You can't do this." A man's voice, panicked and pleading, filled the air. "We had a deal," he wheezed. "Deals change," came the cold, menacing reply. "You should have known better than to try and double-cross us." I crept closer to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just a heated argument, it was something much darker. "Please, I'll get you the money. I just need more time." The first voice was now desperate. "Time's up," the second voice said. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. I peeked through the crack in the door just in time to see a tall man in a dark suit seize the other man by the throat. There was a flash of metal, a muffled cry, and then the sickening sound of a body collapsing to the floor. I clapped a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp, stumbling backward. My mind reeled, unable to process what I had just witnessed. A murder. I had just seen a murder. For a moment, I stood frozen, unsure what to do. Then I heard movement from inside the lounge, and panic took over. I turned and ran, my bare feet slapping against the deck as I fled back to my cabin. Once inside, I locked the door and sank to the floor, trembling. What should I do? Alert the ship's security? But what if the killer had connections on board? On a cruise ship, there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I spent the night in a state of high alert, jumping at every sound in the corridor outside. By morning, exhausted and frayed, I decided I needed to tell someone. I made my way to the purser's desk, constantly looking over my shoulder. The cheerful young woman behind the counter smiled brightly as I approached. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" I leaned in close, lowering my voice. "I need to speak with security, it's urgent." Her smile faltered slightly, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "Of course, sir. May I ask what this is regarding?" I hesitated, suddenly aware of how crazy I might sound. "I witnessed something last night, something terrible." She nodded, her expression turning serious. "I see. If you'll just wait a moment, I'll have our head of security come speak with you." As I waited, my paranoia grew. What if the killer saw me talking to security? What if he was watching me right now? A tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp white uniform approached. "Sir, I'm Chief Morris, head of ship security. I understand you have something to report." I nodded, glancing around nervously before speaking in a low voice. "Last night, I saw a murder in the Starlight Lounge." Chief Morris's eyebrows shot up. "A murder? Are you certain?" I recounted what I had seen and heard, my words tumbling out in a rush. As I spoke, the chief's expression grew increasingly grave. "This is a very serious accusation," he said when I finished. "We'll need to investigate immediately. Please come with me." He led me to a small office and asked me to wait while he gathered his team. As I sat there, my mind raced. What if they didn't believe me? What if the killer had already disposed of the body? When Chief Morris returned with 2 other security officers, I repeated my story. They asked detailed questions about what I had seen and heard, taking careful notes. "We'll conduct a thorough search of the Starlight Lounge," Chief Morris assured me. "In the meantime, I must ask you to keep this information confidential. We don't want to cause a panic among the passengers." I nodded, relieved that they were taking me seriously but still on edge. As I left the security office, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety. I tried to go about my normal vacation activities, but every face I saw seemed suspicious. Was that man by the pool the killer? Did that woman in the buffet line know something? By evening, I was a nervous wreck. I jumped at every announcement over the ship's PA system, half expecting it to be news of a body found. But nothing came. As I picked at my dinner in the main dining room, a hand landed on my shoulder. I nearly leaped out of my skin. "Sir." It was one of the security officers from earlier. Chief Morris would like to see you. My heart pounding, I followed him back to the security office. Chief Morris was waiting, his expression unreadable. We've conducted a thorough search of the Starlight Lounge and the surrounding areas, he said once we were seated. I'm afraid we found no evidence of any crime taking place. I stared at him in disbelief. But I saw it. I heard it. Chief Morris held up a hand. I understand you believe what you saw was real, but we've reviewed the security footage, interviewed staff members who were on duty last night, and found nothing to corroborate your story. The footage, I said, grasping at straws. Can I see it? Maybe I can point out the men I saw. The chief shook his head. I'm sorry, but we can't share security footage with passengers. It's against company policy. I slumped in my chair, defeat washing over me. They didn't believe me. Or worse, what if they were in on it? Sir. Chief Morris leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. Is it possible that what you saw was a misunderstanding? Perhaps a rehearsal for one of the ship's theatrical productions? I wanted to argue, to insist that what I had seen was real. But doubt had begun to creep in. Had I imagined it all? Was the stress of my job, the sudden freedom of vacation, playing tricks on my mind? I don't know anymore, I admitted, my voice small. Chief Morris nodded sympathetically. It's not uncommon for passengers to experience vivid dreams or misinterpret things they see, especially if they're not used to the shipboard environment. I can assure you, if there had been any foul play, we would have found evidence of it. I left the security office feeling dazed and confused. As I wandered the ship's corridors, every laugh, every shadow seemed to mock me. Had I really imagined the whole thing? The next few days of the cruise passed in a haze. I went through the motions of enjoying my vacation, but the joy had been sucked out of it. I couldn't shake the memory of what I had seen or thought I had seen. On the last night of the cruise, as I packed my suitcase, there was a knock at my cabin door. My heart leaped into my throat. Had the killer finally come for me? With trembling hands, I opened the door to find a ship steward holding an envelope. Message for you, sir, he said cheerfully, handing it over before continuing on his rounds. Inside the envelope was a simple note. Asterisk, thank you for your discretion. Enjoy the rest of your vacation. Sam. Asterisk, I stared at the note, my mind racing. Sam. Chief Morris. Was this confirmation that I hadn't imagined it all? Or was it just a polite way of thanking me for not causing a panic among the other passengers? As the ship docked the following morning and I joined the crowd disembarking, I found myself scanning the faces around me. Was the killer one of us, blending in with the excited tourists heading home? Or had he slipped away during one of our port stops, disappearing into the warm Caribbean sunlight? I never found out. In the years that followed that cruise, I've replayed those events over and over in my mind. Sometimes I'm convinced it was real, a cover-up of a terrible crime. Other times, I question if it was all just my imagination running wild, fueled by too many mystery novels. One thing I know for sure, I never went on another cruise. The gentle rocking of a ship that once promised relaxation now only serves as a reminder of that night, of how thin the line is between paradise and nightmare, and how quickly one can transform into the other. To this day, whenever I see an advertisement for a luxury cruise, I think of moonlight on dark water, raised voices behind a half-open door, and the sickening thud of a body hitting the floor. I wonder about the secrets hiding behind those glossy images of sunsets and smiling passengers. Because sometimes the most dangerous waters aren't the ones you see. They are the ones you're sailing through, blissfully unaware of the darkness lurking just beneath the surface. So, I'm 18 and from the UK, and this happened back in February 2019 when I was 17. I was set up on a semi-blind date with a guy named Cameron who was 19. We'd seen some photos of each other through a mutual friend, and my friend told me a bit about him. Cameron seemed like a typical guy, maybe into video games and anime, but nothing particularly unusual. My friend gave us each other's numbers, and we texted for the night before deciding to meet at a Starbucks the next day since we were both free. Normally, I don't like to meet new people so quickly, but I figured since he knew my friend, it would be fine. Boy, was I wrong. I arrived slightly early, ordered my coffee, since I never like it when guys feel like they have to buy for me, and sat down at a table facing away from the door, pulling out my book. I'd been there about 15 minutes when I got a text saying he was there. I thought, great, I'm at X table, and then I felt a presence behind me. I turned my head slightly to acknowledge it, thinking it must be him. But before I could even say hello, he leans in and latches his lips onto my neck, sucking on it. Now, I really don't like people touching my neck. I'm super ticklish there, and it makes me uncomfortable. I've always had to hold in discomfort during massages or hair treatments, but this was way beyond that. It felt like he was clinging to me like some kind of leech. And on top of that, he smelled horrible, like dust personified. I freaked out and elbowed him in the chest to get him off me. He finally let go and looked at me with this weird expression, laughing deadpan, which was honestly really creepy, and I started getting alarmed. I asked him what the heck that was, and he casually said, "I thought it was cute." Cute? In what world? I tried to start a conversation, thinking, okay, first impressions don't mean much. But then he just stared at my chest and said, "Wow, I didn't know Asians could have boobs like those. I better not let you go." That was a direct quote. At this point, I was distinctly uncomfortable but didn't want to just run away. The whole situation gave me such bad vibes. So I went to the bathroom and waited for someone to come in. I asked the woman who came in to help me get out without him noticing. She agreed, lent me a hat and scarf. It was February in the UK, and helped me sneak out the back door. He asked my friend where I went, but I told my friend to never mention me again. I was too scared. I know I probably didn't handle it well. I should have just told him I wasn't interested and left, but I was honestly terrified. Some people asked my friend about what happened, and she actually scolded me for leaving without telling Cameron and said I was horrible for not giving him a chance. So I ended up unfriending her too. I just couldn't keep people like that in my life. But I want to let everyone know that I'm actually okay. It's been over a year since I've even seen a glimpse of Cameron. Thanks to anyone who was concerned, but I'm doing fine. We all need a good Samaritan now and then, so if you ever see someone in need like I was that day, please be like that woman and help someone out. The moment I realized Sarah was gone, it felt like I'd been dropped into a freezing lake. 1 second, she was there, sitting beside me in the passenger seat, and the next, nothing. Just an empty space where a person should have been. It was as though the rainy night had reached into the car and swallowed her whole, leaving me alone with a mystery that would haunt me for years. It had been a long day at the office, the kind where the harsh fluorescent lights seemed to drain the life out of you, and the ticking of the clock on the wall mocked every second. I was the last one out, as usual, locking up just as the storm clouds rolled in. That's when I saw Sarah, huddled under the building's awning, clutching her jacket tightly around her. I knew her in passing. She worked 2 floors below me in accounting. We'd exchanged pleasantries a few times in the elevator, but that was about it. "Need a ride?" I called out, already feeling the raindrops hitting my face. She looked relieved. "Are you sure? I don't want to impose." I waved off her concern. "It's no trouble. Where do you live?" I asked. As it turned out, her apartment was on my way home. We dashed to my car, the rain pouring down in sheets. Once inside, I cranked up the heat, noticing how she shivered slightly in her damp clothes. "Thanks again," she said, offering a small smile. "I usually take the bus, but with this weather, no problem," I replied, pulling out of the parking lot. "I'm Tom, by the way. I don't think we've properly introduced ourselves." "Sarah," she said, though I already knew her name. "Nice to finally meet you, Tom." We fell into easy conversation as I navigated the rain-slicked streets. Sarah was funny and quick-witted, and I found myself enjoying her company more than I'd expected. We talked about work, our weekend plans, the latest office gossip. Felt nice, normal. But as the rain picked up, it became harder to see more than a few feet ahead. I leaned forward, squinting through the windshield, the wipers working overtime. "This is crazy," I muttered. "I can barely see the road. Maybe we should pull over?" Sarah suggested, concern creeping into her voice. I shook my head. "We're almost to your place. Just a few more minutes." I glanced over at her, offering what I hoped was a reassuring smile. She smiled back, but there was tension in her eyes. That was the last time I saw her. I turned my focus back to the road, trying to avoid hydroplaning through the deep puddles forming in the rain. The rhythmic swish of the wipers and the drumming of rain on the roof filled the car. "So, any big plans this weekend?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. No response. "Sarah?" I turned to look at her again, and my heart nearly stopped. The passenger seat was empty. I slammed on the brakes, the car fishtailing slightly before coming to a stop. For a long moment, I just sat there staring at the vacant seat, trying to process what I was seeing, or rather what I wasn't seeing. "Sarah," I called out again, louder this time. Maybe she'd somehow slipped into the back seat. But no, that was empty too. I got out of the car, rain immediately soaking through my clothes. "Sarah," I yelled, my voice barely audible over the storm. There was no sign of her anywhere. My mind raced. Had she jumped out of the car? But why? And how hadn't I noticed? The door hadn't opened. I would have felt the rush of wind and rain, and we'd been going at least 40 miles per hour. If she'd somehow fallen out, she'd be seriously injured. I walked up and down the street calling her name, peering into the darkness. But there was nothing, just empty sidewalks and the relentless rain. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I got back in the car shaking from both cold and shock. I sat there, water dripping from my hair, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I imagined her? No, that was impossible. We'd had a whole conversation. I could still smell her perfume in the car. I drove home in a daze, my mind replaying every moment of the drive. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd convinced myself that I must have dropped her off and somehow forgotten about it. Stress and fatigue can do strange things to a person's memory, right? But when I checked my phone, there were no messages from Sarah thanking me for the ride. And when I got to work on Monday, ready to apologize for my apparent lapse in memory, I was met with confused looks. Sarah from accounting, the receptionist said, frowning, "We don't have anyone by that name working here." I felt like I was losing my mind. I described Sarah, her dark hair, her green eyes, the little scar on her left hand, but no one seemed to know who I was talking about. I went down to the accounting department thinking maybe there had been some misunderstanding. But as I walked through the office, I realized I didn't recognize anyone there. Faces I thought I knew suddenly seemed unfamiliar. "Can I help you?" a woman asked, noticing my confused wandering. "I'm looking for Sarah," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "She works here in accounting." The woman shook her head. "I'm sorry, there's no Sarah in this department. Are you sure you have the right floor?" I mumbled an apology and left, my head spinning. Back at my desk, I tried to focus on work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. During my lunch break, I decided to do some digging. I searched the company directory, social media, even local news articles. There was no trace of Sarah anywhere. As the days turned into weeks, I became obsessed with finding her. I retraced our drive that night countless times, always in the rain, hoping to recreate the conditions. I put up flyers with her description, much to the concern of my coworkers who were starting to worry about my mental state. I even went to the police, but without a last name or any proof that Sarah had ever existed, they couldn't do much. The detective listened to my story with a mixture of skepticism and pity. "Look, Mr. Thompson," he said gently, "sometimes our minds play tricks on us, especially in stressful situations. Are you sure you didn't just imagine this woman?" But I knew I hadn't imagined her. The memory of our conversation was too vivid, too real. The way she laughed at my lame jokes, the slight crinkle around her eyes when she smiled, these weren't things you could invent. Months passed, and slowly life began to return to normal, or at least a new kind of normal. I still thought about Sarah every day, but the intensity of my search faded. I had to accept that I might never know what happened that rainy night. And then, exactly 1 year later, it happened again. I was driving home from work, another late night, another rainstorm. As I stopped at a red light, I glanced over at the passenger seat out of habit. My heart nearly stopped. Sarah was sitting there looking exactly as she had that night a year ago. She turned to me, a sad smile on her face. "Hello, Tom," she said softly. "I'm sorry I disappeared on you like that." I couldn't speak, couldn't move. I just stared at her, afraid that if I blinked, she'd vanish again. "I know you have questions," she continued, "but I can't answer them. I'm not even sure I understand it myself. All I know is that sometimes on rainy nights like this, I exist and sometimes I don't." The light turned green, but I didn't move. Cars behind me started honking. "You have to let me go, Tom," Sarah said, her form already beginning to fade. "For both our sakes, just remember, not everything in this world can be explained. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved." And with that, she was gone again. I sat there, oblivious to the angry horns blaring behind me, tears mixing with the rain on my face. Part of me wanted to start searching again, to prove to myself and everyone else that I wasn't crazy. But a bigger part of me knew Sarah was right. Some things can't be explained. They can't be solved. As I finally drove home, a weight seemed to lift from my shoulders. The mystery of Sarah would always stay with me. A reminder that the world is stranger and more wonderful than we can imagine. And on rainy nights, I'd always keep an eye on my passenger seat, just in case. Because you never know when someone might appear or disappear right before your eyes. On New Year's Eve 2002, Rachel Moran, a 21-year-old from Hull on the British East Coast, was heading to a party to ring in the new year. Like many of her peers, she planned to celebrate the occasion in style. She wore her best skirt, carefully applied her makeup, and made her way on foot to her mother's house, where family and friends were already celebrating. As midnight approached, Rachel joined the countdown, eagerly awaiting the start of the new year, just like so many others around the country. After hours of drinking and dancing, Rachel decided it was time to head home. Little did she know, this would be the final night of her short life, and she would never be seen alive again. The court would later hear the horrifying details. Rachel was stabbed 20 times in the head and neck before her lifeless body was hidden for weeks in a tiny cupboard inside her killer's flat. Rachel, an aspiring singer, had been lured to the flat of a man named Michael Little in the early hours of New Year's Day. It was there that she was attacked from behind. Forensic evidence revealed that Michael Little had performed intimate acts on her, but it was unclear whether this had happened before or after her death. After the brutal assault, it was said that Little wrapped Rachel's body in a thin bedroom curtain and concealed it in a small locked cupboard. Michael Little, a 23-year-old man from Nash Court Hall, pleaded not guilty to the murder of Rachel. The crime, which took place in the opening hours of January 2003, sparked a massive police investigation and left the city in shock when Rachel's body was eventually discovered. The search for Rachel began after she failed to return home to the apartment she shared with her boyfriend, Mark Shepard, following a New Year's Eve celebration at her mother's house on Hall Road. Rachel had left the family home at around 1:40 a.m. on New Year's Day, intending to walk back to her own apartment. Prosecutor Jeffrey Marson QC told the court that Rachel had hugged her mother, Wanda, before leaving and promised to call her as soon as she arrived home. Tragically, Wanda Moran would never see her daughter alive again. Coincidentally, Michael Little was walking home along the same route as Rachel that night. Sometime after about 2:20 a.m., he lured Rachel into his flat. Shortly after they arrived, he attacked her with a large knife. In the brutal attack, her killer stabbed her from behind at least 20 times to the head, back, chest, and neck. He used such force that on occasions the knife went right through her body. At some stage, the defendant had intercourse with Rachel. It is not possible to say whether that took place before or after the attack. Mr. Morrison said that after Michael Little wrapped her body in the curtain and concealed it in the cupboard outside the door to his flat, He set about cleaning up the vast majority of blood using bleach and paper towels. Over the course of the next week or so, Michael Little apparently attempted to separate himself from the evidence of his crimes, disposing of various items of Rachel's personal property by throwing them into a nearby drain. Yet, as Humberside police continued to investigate Rachel's disappearance, highly trained police divers found personal items such as trainers, a handbag, passport, bra, thong, and diary in the drain. The passport was one heck of a find, and Little had made a serious mistake in disposing of it in the same manner as the other items. It clued police as to exactly who the items belonged to. As a result, they decided to search the nearby groups of houses near to Rachel's Sachs Court home, and Michael Little's nearby flat just happened to be in the designated search area. When police investigators arrived at his home, they began intensely searching his first-floor flat, but unfortunately found nothing in their initial attempts. They then asked for a key to the cupboard located near to his front door. A reasonable request, but one that raised extreme suspicion when he repeatedly claimed that he had no key to the cupboard after having accidentally misplaced it. Police were determined to search it thoroughly and eventually resorted to brute strength to tear the door from its hinges. Police on the scene would later say that they smelled a kind of rotten meat odor coming from the cupboard, and after moving various boxes, found her decomposing body hidden inside. It is thought that she had been stuffed inside the tiny cramped space for almost a month. Prosecutor Jeffrey Marson QC told a court that Michael Little said that the body in the cupboard was her. Martin then quoted Little's statement to the police soon after they uncovered the evidence. "I need to get off my chest. I wanted to tell somebody for so long." Michael Little is thought to have said, "I can't be normal. I must be evil. A normal person would not do that." The courtroom was shown CCTV footage of Rachel walking to her parents' home on New Year's Eve and also of her walking home in the early hours of New Year's Day. She was heading home after speaking to her boyfriend, who was at a party on a nearby council estate. CCTV footage showed her in a leather jacket, dress, and white trainers walking past the local convenience store. The same camera picked up Michael Little walking in exactly the same direction and route as Rachel about a minute prior to the unfortunate victim. But a CCTV camera near Rachel's home showed that by a few minutes later, Little was walking around 40 seconds behind Rachel. This was overwhelming evidence that he had followed her, maybe even stalked her for a little while before choosing his moment. Michael Little later claimed to the investigating officers that Rachel had ran up to him and asked in a friendly manner if she could walk with him because it would make her feel safer. He then invited her to his flat just a few 100 yards from her home where they had a drink. He is alleged to have told police that they then argued, and he backhanded her. He then claimed that she had slashed his arm with a small knife, and that what followed had been acts of self-defense on his part. Michael Little had been drinking with friends at the Good Fellowship Inn on New Year's Eve before attending a party, leaving to return home at around 1 a.m. The 16-stone defendant had drunk several pints of beer, Alka Pops, and even a quadruple vodka. Faint bloodstains were found in the hallway of Little's home, and zigzag patterns found by the front door matched Rachel's trainers. Little refused to answer police questions in interview. Prosecutor Jeffrey Marson QC said it is clear the defendant was responsible for Rachel's death and that he's guilty of murder. Michael Little showed no emotion as a jury at Hall Crown Court found him guilty of the murder of Rachel Moran in the early hours of New Year's Day. If ever there was a murderer deserving of life imprisonment, it is Michael Little. About 7 years ago, when I was 20 and in college, I was trying to make some extra money. I took a job as a live-in caregiver for a 98-year-old woman named Lillian, who had Alzheimer's, in Flint, Michigan. I wasn't trained as thoroughly as I should have been, but I did as much research as I could and tried my best to make her feel comfortable. Still, there were times when I got frustrated. One of those times was on a hot summer night, probably around 2 a.m., when I was suddenly awakened by Lillian screaming from her bedroom. I rushed in to find her sitting in her laundry basket. After helping her up, I realized she had wet herself. I took her to the bathroom to clean her up, and she explained that she thought the laundry basket was the toilet. Once she sat down, she couldn't get back up. My heart broke for her. I reassured her as best as I could, telling her everything would be fine. I promised to clean up, run her laundry again, and stay up the rest of the night in case she needed anything. Once Lillian had fallen back asleep, I threw her laundry in the wash and decided to sneak out for a quick cigarette. Yes, I know, I'm one of those nasty, horrible smokers. I went to sit in my car to use the air conditioning and called my best friend to see if she was still awake, so I could vent a little. Plus, I just needed to talk to someone. It was late, and I was alone in the car. As a woman, it's natural to feel uneasy being alone at night, especially in those circumstances. I hadn't even been on the phone for more than 2 minutes when I suddenly got a strange feeling. Something was telling me to look over my left shoulder. When I did, I saw a younger guy, maybe late teens, early 20s, walking down the sidewalk in my direction with a sweatshirt on. His hood was up. Now remember, this is the middle of summer, so immediately I felt as though something was off. But who am I to say this guy isn't cold? One of my flaws is being too afraid to hurt people's feelings even when the situation calls for it. I knew in that moment that I needed to lock my doors, but I didn't want this guy to hear the sound of my doors locking and feel like I thought he was a criminal just for walking down the sidewalk. My body is screaming warning signs at me. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up. Felt hard to breathe. I knew my friend was still talking, but I couldn't really hear a word she said. I was afraid to turn my head to see where he was. I was frozen. Suddenly, my friend's voice became clear to me. She was yelling at me. "Hey, why are you answering me? What's going on?" I turned my head to the right just in time to see him reaching for my passenger door handle. Without even having to think, I somehow managed to reach up with my left hand and hit the lock button for the doors just as he started pulling at the handle. His right hand was in the front pocket of his sweatshirt. He seemed to have been holding on to something with his other hand, and he was pulling up my handle with such force that the entire car was jerking back and forth. I didn't move. I didn't scream. I just watched him. I remember his eyes staring into mine. He looked angry. Just as I start to think this is it, he's gonna get in somehow, he's gonna hurt or end my life, he suddenly stops. He stood there for a quick second and then turned and ran away. In that moment, I burst into tears. I was scared, angry, and confused. What just happened? What was he trying to do? Steal my car? Is he going to come back? Lastly, even though I was happy about it, why did he suddenly stop and run away like that? I called 911. The dispatcher asked me if there was any way for me to leave the area. I wanted to, but then I realized Lillian. I needed to get back in that house, but I was terrified to step foot out of my car. I took a few deep breaths and decided I didn't have time to think about it. I needed to make sure she was okay. I got back in the house and immediately went to her room. She was sound asleep. I felt a huge sense of relief. I took a walk through the house and checked all the doors and windows to make sure we were safe. Everything was secure. I sat on the couch in the living room in the dark and waited for the cops to come. For those of you who don't know much about Flint, this type of call is not their top priority. Took them 4 hours to respond. At that point, obviously, there is nothing they can do. He was long gone. I still think about that night more often than I would like to admit. The what-ifs are the hardest part. All I know is I hope to never be in a situation like that again. The moment I spotted the rusted shovel half buried in the ground, I realized our seemingly innocent camping trip had just taken a dark turn. Little did I know, that shovel was only the start of a nightmare that would push us to the brink of survival. Mike, what began as a weekend getaway with my 3 best friends quickly spiraled into a fight for our lives against a threat we never saw coming. Looking back, I can't believe how naive we were. So unprepared for the evil that lay hidden in those woods. It was supposed to be a trip for us guys to reconnect, to escape from everything and enjoy some time together. Me, Tom, Dave, and Chris had been close since college. But life, as it tends to do, pulled us in different directions. This camping trip was meant to be a way to bring back that old bond. We picked a remote spot, miles away from the nearest town or cell signal. Dave had called it real wilderness, with a grin as we turned off the main road onto a rough dirt track. No tourists, no rangers, just us and nature. If only we'd known what awaited us out there. The first day was flawless. We hiked, fished in a pristine stream, and set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, swapping stories and sharing a bottle of whiskey. It was Chris who first noticed something felt off. He'd gone to gather more firewood and returned looking pale. "Guys," he said, his voice trembling a little, "I think I found something strange out there." We followed him into the woods, our flashlights cutting through the dark. About 100 yards from our camp, Chris stopped and pointed. There, half buried under the underbrush, was an old shovel. "So what?" Tom chuckled. "Someone left their gardening tools, big deal." But as I swept my light around, I saw more. A rusted tin can, remnants of what could have been a tent. This wasn't just an abandoned tool. It was a campsite, and judging by its state of decay, it had been abandoned for a long time. "Let's head back," I suggested, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. "It's getting late." We returned to our camp, but the carefree vibe was gone. We turned in early, each of us silently turning the encounter over in our minds. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I listened, I realized it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was whistling, a tune I didn't recognize, eerily discordant. I unzipped my tent, peering into the darkness. The fire had burned down to just embers, casting a faint red glow over the clearing. And there, at the edge of the light, stood a figure, tall and thin. It remained unnaturally still. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape against the deeper dark of the woods. The whistling was coming from it. "Hey!" I called out, my voice cracking. "Who's there?" The whistling stopped abruptly. The figure remained motionless for a moment, then slowly, deliberately turned and walked into the forest, disappearing from view. I was fully awake now, my heart pounding. I woke the others, telling them what I'd seen. Dave and Chris were spooked, but Tom remained skeptical. "You were probably half asleep," he said. "Dreamed the whole thing." But I knew what I'd seen, and judging by the nervous glances my friends kept throwing towards the tree line, they believed me too. None of us slept much after that. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we were up, packing our gear. We planned to stay 2 more nights, but suddenly, getting back to civilization seemed like a very good idea. We were nearly finished breaking camp when we heard it. A scream, high and terrified, coming from the direction of the old campsite we'd found. We froze, looking at each other in horror. "That sounded like a kid," Chris said, his face pale. "We have to help," I said, already moving towards the sound. The others followed, our earlier fear forgotten in the face of someone else's distress. We reached the old campsite, calling out as we went. The screaming had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The rusted shovel was where we'd left it, but now I noticed something we'd missed in the dark. The ground around it was disturbed, as if something had been recently dug up or buried. "Hello?" Dave called out. "Is anyone there?" We heard screaming. No response, just the rustle of leaves in the breeze. We were about to give up and head back when Tom spotted something, a flash of color in the underbrush. He reached down and pulled out a child's backpack, bright pink and decorated with cartoon characters. "Oh God," Chris whispered. "There really is a kid out here." That's when we heard the whistling again, the same discordant tune from the night before. It was coming from deeper in the forest, and it was moving away from us. Without a word, we took off after it. The underbrush was thick, branches whipping at our faces as we ran. The whistling always seemed just out of reach, leading us deeper and deeper into the woods. Suddenly, the trees opened up into a small clearing. In the center stood a cabin, old and decrepit. The whistling had stopped. We approached cautiously, calling out. No response. The cabin door stood slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. "We should go in," I said, though every instinct screamed at me to run if there's a kid in there. Tom nodded, pulling out his hunting knife. "Or I'll go first." The door creaked as Tom pushed it open. The interior was dark, musty. Our flashlight beams revealed a single room, sparsely furnished, a table, a chair, a bed with rotting sheets, and on the walls. Jesus, Dave breathed. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, maybe 1,000. And in every photo was a child. Different ages, different races, but all with the same terrified expression. "We need to get out of here," Chris said, his voice shaking. "Now." But as we turned to leave, we found our exit blocked. The tall figure from last night stood in the doorway, and now I could see him clearly. He was gaunt, almost skeletal, with pale skin and eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. And he was smiling. "Welcome," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "I've been waiting for you." What followed was a nightmare of violence and desperation. We fought like cornered animals, using anything we could get our hands on as weapons. I took a blow to the head that left me dazed, barely aware of the chaos around me. I remember flashes. Tom slashing with his knife, Dave throwing a chair, Chris screaming as the man's hands closed around his throat. And then, suddenly, it was over. The man lay still on the cabin floor, Tom's knife protruding from his chest. We were alive, battered and bloodied. But alive. We stumbled out of the cabin, gasping in the fresh air. That's when we heard it. A small whimper, coming from behind the cabin. We stumbled upon a cellar door, hidden beneath a thick blanket of weeds. Inside, huddled in the shadows, were 3 children. The oldest couldn't have been more than 10. They were filthy, terrified, but alive. What happened next is a blur. The long trek back to our car, carrying the children who were too weak to walk. The frantic drive to the nearest town. The police, the paramedics, the endless questions. It wasn't until later that we learned the man had been abducting children for years. The cabin had been his hideout, so isolated that no one had ever discovered it. Until we did. They called us heroes, praised us for saving those kids' lives. But as I sat in the hospital, getting stitches for the gash on my forehead, all I could think about were the photos on the wall. How many others hadn't been saved? How long had this been happening? It's been 6 months since that day in the woods. The nightmares have mostly faded, but I still wake up now and then, hearing that eerie whistle. The 4 of us don't talk about it much, but there's an unspoken bond between us now, forged in that cabin, one that will never break. We went into those woods seeking adventure, hoping to relive the thrill of our youth. We came out as changed men, with a hard understanding of the evil that can hide in the quiet corners of the world. I still go camping, still love the tranquility of the forest. But now I always keep one eye on the tree line, because I know now the real monsters aren't the bears or the wolves. They're the ones that look just like us, the ones who whistle in the dark. Now 36. I live in Baguio City, Philippines, a place perched high on the mountains. I can still recall a memory from when I was around 8 or 9 years old. One summer when all the kids were on break. As the youngest, my brothers and their friends would rarely let me join in on their games. I had my own friends, mostly girls, but I always wished I could be part of the big boys club. One day, my brothers went out, leaving me home alone with my parents. My mom gave me permission to play outside, but none of my usual playmates were around. With no one to join me, I decided to entertain myself. Our neighborhood, built on the mountains, had its fair share of thick grass and mounds of dirt, which gave me the perfect setting to dig and explore. To get to a small patch of bare land, I made my way through the tall bushes. While digging, a little girl, about my age, approached me and asked if she could join in. Grateful for the company, I agreed. We played for hours, though she never told me her name, despite me introducing myself multiple times. Every time I asked, she would either stay silent or change the topic. As the evening drew closer, I knew I had to go inside, so I said goodbye. Before I left, she asked me to meet her again the next day at the same spot. The next day, the whole neighborhood was out, including my brothers. I got distracted playing with my friends and completely forgot about my promise. But as I suddenly remembered, I saw her in the distance, half hidden behind the bushes, motioning for me to come over. I waved at her and gestured for her to join us. Oddly, She stayed where she was, never stepping out of the bushes, just waiting for me. I thought she might be shy, so I continued playing, hoping she'd eventually join us. After some time, I decided to approach her, but as I neared, she nodded at me, signaling that she was aware of my approach. We reached the same circular patch of land, surrounded by bushes and tall grass. She asked me to come with her to her house. Curious, I asked where she lived, and she pointed to a large rock hidden by bushes, saying her house was behind it. I looked, but there was nothing there, just more grass and rocks. I questioned her, and she insisted, "Just come and I'll show you." Just as I was about to follow her, I heard my brother calling my name, asking me to come upstairs for a snack. I grabbed my friend's hand and invited her to join us instead. But as we reached the edge of the bushes, she suddenly stopped, just a few steps from the pavement, and said, "I can't go any further. I'll meet you back here when you're done." She then ran back into the bushes, and I couldn't see her anymore. At the time, I didn't realize how strange her behavior had been. The next day, I went straight to the usual spot, eager to spend more time with her. There she was, digging once again, as if continuing the hole I had started days before. I joined her, and she took my hand, pulling me closer to her. Just then, my brothers and their friends showed up, unaware that it was our hideout, one they used to sneak off for a quick drink and smoke. Surprisingly, they allowed me to be there, so we continued to dig as if nothing happened when suddenly my brother asked me, "Why aren't you playing with your friends? They came to the house looking for you. They're in there now waiting for you." It did not occur to me at the time that it was weird they did not even acknowledge my friend's presence, but I told my brother that I would be there in a few minutes. After smoking, my brother and their friends left the area, so I was left alone with my new friend. Again, she held my hand and asked me to come to her house with her behind the big rock. This time, she was forceful and a little aggressive, as if she was desperate for me to go with her, like almost crying. I remember her hugging me 3 times while begging for me to join her. I still remember that moment when I was very uncomfortable with the situation because I know that there was nothing behind that rock. I have been there many times before, and it just leads to another section of thick bushes. I insisted on not going, and I held her hands and dragged her out of the bushes, but she shouted, "Stop. I told you I cannot go past this point." And I replied, "Why? What do you mean?" She forcefully took my hands off hers and ran back to the bushes. I felt really bad, as if I should have joined her, but at the same time I was scared for my own safety. The following day, I decided to spend more time again with her. I asked her to at least come with me and sit in between the pavement in the bushes. She agreed. We sat down while watching the other kids play. We were approached by my friends. Joanna, one of my closest friends, told me, "Hey, let's go to Yvonne's house and watch TV. There will be snacks. Come on." But when I was about to introduce my new friend, Joanna and Yvonne grabbed me by the hand in a hurry, dragging me away from my new friend. I could only look back at her and could not even say goodbye. A few months had passed. My family decided that we will be moving out and living in a different place. During those months, my friendship remained with that girl, same spot, same time. The day we were about to leave, I saw her just peeking from the bushes from inside the car. I was told not to go anywhere by my parents because everything was ready. I remember not removing my eyes off her until I could no longer see her as the car drove away. She did the same, but she made a weird gesture just when we were about to lose sight of each other. She pointed to her head and pointed back at me, and it was the last time that I ever saw her. As a kid, it did not occur to me that my situation was scary. I remembered her, our unnatural friendship. The weird part is, I cannot remember her face at all. It is as if it was wiped from my memory, and I am really good with faces. I can still remember all the kids' faces except for hers. Also, I just realized that she always seemed to wear the same clothes. A dirty white dress, almost yellowish, black shoes with white socks, hair always tied upwards. But the face, I cannot remember her face. Up until now, I always wondered, what if I had joined her to go to her house? What would have happened? It bothers me still today. What happened to her? Is she still alive? Or was she really alive in the first place? I know this was not an imaginary friend because of the emotions, this sensation whenever I was with her. It was all real. It was not an imaginary friend, because I was never sad when I was a kid. Whatever or whoever she was, I am just hoping that she is doing well. This really messed me up for a while, and I'm still not completely okay, but it's easier to deal with now. It was the middle of summer, and my parents had gone away for the weekend to our house in Cape Cod, which is about a 2-hour drive from where we live. It wasn't a big deal for them to leave me alone for a couple of days. My mom made some pulled pork and pasta for me to heat up whenever, and I had some money in case I wanted to order a pizza. Things were pretty good. The first night alone, I stayed up playing Xbox until 3 in the morning, so the next day I woke up pretty late. I checked my phone when I woke up and saw it was already past 1. I had made plans to play street hockey with my friends at 3, so I quickly got up, threw myself into the shower, and tried to get ready. I take long showers, so I ended up spending about 45 minutes in there, scrolling through Reddit and Twitter. That's when I heard the front door open. The bathroom is directly above the front door, and it makes a really loud noise when it opens and closes. I froze instantly because I was supposed to be alone. I waited for about 2 minutes trying to hear anything else. Nothing. I thought maybe the wind had blown it open or that my parents had come back early. So I turned off the shower, wrapped a towel around myself, and started walking down the stairs. I couldn't see the kitchen when I was walking down the stairs. My house was really old, so every step creaked loudly. I tried to move as quietly as I could, probably taking around 45 seconds to make my way down. As I reached the second to last stair, just before I could see into the kitchen, I stopped and took a breath, trying to calm myself. In my head, I knew I was being dumb. There was no way something was in the kitchen. I should have heard any other noise. And even if there were burglars or something, there was no reason they'd still be in the kitchen. After mentally scolding myself for being so paranoid, I chuckled and decided to just walk the last 2 stairs, turn the corner, and head into the kitchen. And then, about 2 feet away from me, standing perfectly still in the middle of the kitchen, was a man staring directly at me. He had this massive smile across his face, and his eyes were locked on mine. What I remember most vividly, though, wasn't his face or his smile. It was his arms. They weren't just hanging at his sides. They were in this strange, unnatural position. He had rotated them almost completely backward and had them lifted slightly behind him, as if he was holding them in a completely reversed posture. I don't know why I remember this so clearly, but it was the weirdest arm position I'd ever seen. Honestly, I thought I was going to have a heart attack right then. Looking back, I realized how terrifying the situation was. But in that moment, I didn't freeze. I took a step toward him and punched him as hard as I could in the jaw. The second I hit him, I bolted up the stairs, leaving my towel in the kitchen and my heart pounding in my chest. I sprinted into my room and locked the door behind me. I quickly put a chair up against the doorknob. Almost without thinking, I called 911 and, nearly in tears, told the operator what happened. As I sat on the floor of my room, in practically the fetal position, staring at the door, praying that a cop would be here soon, I noticed the light coming from the gap between my door had stopped. The man was standing on the other side of the door. There's no words to describe the feeling I had. I was paralyzed with fear, watching the shadow across the bottom of the door shift in tiny ways. I stayed balled up, staring at the gap, praying the man would go away for what seemed like an hour. All the while, the 911 operator was asking, "Hello? Sir? Sir, are you there? Hello?" I didn't want to make a noise, and even if I wanted to move my arms to bring the phone to my mouth, I don't think I could have. Eventually, the light returned to the gap and I heard the faintest of footsteps, slowly creaking the wooden floorboards as he walked down the hall. It was silent for minutes as I just sat there curled up, unable to even speak. I heard banging on the front door and the sound of 2 officers entering my house. I finally felt safe and I opened the door to the 2 of them standing there. I almost cried. Nowadays, my parents don't even leave me home alone, which I honestly don't mind, and I check every lock in the house before going to bed. I still get nightmares occasionally, and my heart starts racing whenever I see someone standing still. But I'm doing all right. Even working with sketch artists in a few lineups, The police never found who was in my house. It sends shivers down my spine every time I look outside, half expecting to see him standing across the street, smiling under a lamp post. I have no idea what he wanted or who he was, but regardless, I hope I never see him again. And I'm still afraid that someday he might come back. This event happened over 10 years ago, back when I was 13. Before I get into it, I should mention that I had a very overprotective mother, like textbook overprotective. One thing she often did was come into my room at different times throughout the night to check on me. It was something I really didn't like, mainly because I'm a light sleeper and I scare easily. So most of the time when she came to check on me, she'd either wake me up or scare the hell out of me. One night, I was getting ready for bed. All I knew was that it was a school night because I had classes the next day. I had the TV on, as I always did, to help me fall asleep. I like to sleep all cocooned up, with the blankets pulled over my head. I had just closed my eyes when I started hearing footsteps from outside my door. I sighed, knowing my mom was about to come in and check on me. I got out of my cozy blanket cocoon and sat up in bed, waiting. That way, at least she wouldn't scare me. I waited for a minute, but my mom didn't come in. I could still hear her footsteps, though, which confused me. It sounded like she was pacing back and forth outside my room. What is she doing? I wondered. There was no reason for her to be walking past my room or pacing in front of it. The only room beyond mine was my sister's, but she had moved out a long time ago. So, I couldn't figure out why my mom would be walking back and forth. I finally got out of bed and opened the door to ask her what in the world she was doing. But when I opened the door, there was no one there. This made me even more confused. So I looked up and down the hallway. Still, no sign of my mom. There's no way I could have missed her. At this point, I thought maybe she was playing a prank on me, something my family sometimes did. So I decided to go across the house to her room. When I reached her room, I stopped in my tracks. There she was, calmly lying in her bed. It was clear that she hadn't been messing with me. If she had been, there was no way she could have made it back to her room without me seeing her unless she ran. But she looked too relaxed. Her breathing was too calm to suggest she'd been running. I walked over to her bed, and I must have made some noise because she turned over and faced me. She asked me what was wrong, and I asked her if she had come into my room to check on me. She said no, and I really wish she hadn't. I don't know what kind of face I was making, but it was obvious from the way her expression changed that she knew something was wrong. She didn't ask any more questions, though, and just let me go back to my room. I practically ran back to my room, terrified, and immediately shut the door behind me. I dived into my bed, trying to shake off the fear and convince myself it was just my imagination. I pulled the covers up over me and tried to settle back down to sleep. I shut my eyes tightly and lay completely still. It only felt like a few seconds go by before I hear the footsteps again. I sit back up, throwing the covers off, and turn off my TV, hoping that the old thing was just making odd noises. Well, that didn't work, and it just made the sounds of the footsteps even louder. Although now I'm scared out of my mind, I make my way back over to the door and open it. Once again, finding the hallway empty and dark, I quickly step out to the hallway and turn on the light before going back into my room. In my mind, the light will keep away whatever was there, but that wasn't the case. I get back in my bed and sit, just watching the door, and that's when it happens. My heart stops when I see a shadow slowly pass by under the crack of my door. I remember all the air leaving my lungs and just the absolute terror I felt at that moment. I had no clue as to what I could do. All I know is I just wanted to keep whoever it was out. For the rest of the night, I just sat on my bed, my knees pulled up to my chest, just watching whoever it was walk back and forth. I didn't know how nor when, but I had fallen asleep at one point and awoke the next morning extremely tired. I told my mom what had happened, and while she did listen and pay attention to my worries, seeing as there was nothing she could do, it was brushed off. She did tell me if this happened again, and if I was too scared to sleep in my room, I could come to her room and sleep there. For the next few days, I slept with my door locked, but the mysterious footsteps never happened again. To this day, I have no clue who or what it was. A spirit? An intruder? Seeing as they didn't harm me and just scared me, I don't think it was malevolent, but I'd still really like to know what or who it was and why they were there. It started with the neighbor. I had only lived in the building for a few months when I noticed him. An old man in apartment 3B, just across the hall. He never spoke, never made a sound. But every evening, at exactly 9:17 p.m., he would step out into the dimly lit hallway and just stand there, watching. He wasn't looking at anything in particular. Not at me, not at the floor, not even at the door in front of him. His head was tilted slightly, his posture too rigid, too unnatural, like he had forgotten how to be human. I tried not to stare, but every night, at exactly 9:17, I heard the door creak open, followed by the sound of his slow, deliberate breathing. And then one night, I made the mistake of opening my door. I had just come home from work, exhausted, my brain foggy from a long day. Without thinking, I twisted the lock and pushed open the door. He was already there, standing in the hallway, facing me, too close. For the first time, I got a clear look at him. His face wasn't right. It wasn't that he looked old, it was that he looked incomplete, like a wax figure left unfinished. His eyes were too smooth, lacking depth. His lips moved slightly, but no words came out. And then he smiled. It was the wrong kind of smile, too wide, stretching too far across his face. The corners of his mouth curled unnaturally, and his lips parted just enough to reveal teeth that weren't quite human. I slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking as I locked it, pressing my body against the wood. The silence stretched. My own breath felt deafening in the quiet. I stood there for what felt like hours, heart pounding, ears straining for movement outside. Then, just before I could convince myself it was all in my head, there was a sound, a slow, deliberate knock. I didn't answer. I didn't move. And after a few minutes, the knock came again, and again, and again. Each knock a little harder, a little more insistent. I spent the night on the floor, pressed into the farthest corner of my apartment, waiting for it to stop. By morning, the knocking had ceased. But when I finally gathered the courage to check through the peephole, my breath caught in my throat. The hallway was empty, except for one thing. A slip of paper slid under my door. Let me in. I reported it to the landlord, to the building manager, to anyone who would listen. But when I asked about 3B, they just looked at me like I was insane. There's no one in that unit, they said. It's been empty for years. That night, I blocked my door with everything I could find. The couch, a bookshelf, a chair wedged under the handle. I left every light in my apartment on, sitting in the glow of the television, waiting for morning. But at exactly 9:17 p.m., my lights flickered. The television screen warped, static humming through the speakers. The bulbs dimmed, casting long shadows across the walls. And then, from the other side of the door, I heard it, breathing, long, shallow, slow. Something pressed against the door. The wood creaked, the handle rattled. I held my breath, gripping the arms of my chair, willing myself not to move. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything except for that sound. Then, as suddenly as it began, the breathing stopped. The silence stretched, unnatural, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found another note under my door. You don't have to be afraid. Just open the door. I left that day. I packed only what I could carry and never looked back. I didn't tell anyone why. I just needed to be gone. The landlord didn't seem surprised when I returned the key. Didn't ask for an explanation. Just nodded like he had seen this before. I moved across town, found a new place, surrounded by noise, by people. I kept the lights on. I kept my door locked. But every night at exactly 9:17 p.m., my phone screen flickers. The lights dim for just a second, and I hear it again. That slow, deliberate breathing, right outside my door. I've heard countless stories from people about their experiences with sleep paralysis, and I wanted to share my scariest ones. Many people have heard of the shadow people, and I've had my share of creepy experiences with an unknown black force pinning me down in bed, suffocating me. But the other two instances I've had are even more bizarre, and I still think about them often. This was about 4 years ago when I was 24. I was living with my mom since I was in my second year of nursing school, and it just made more sense to stay at home while I was going to school. One night, I went to bed, and everything seemed normal until I suddenly woke up for no reason. I couldn't move or talk. Then, I heard these static-like mumbling sounds coming from my left. Completely terrified, I listened as I tried to move, but I couldn't. Slowly, the static started to clear up, and I heard the voices of young children. They began chanting, "You're going to die," and giggling after each chant, almost like they were singing a twisted nursery rhyme. They repeated the chant over and over again. My heart was racing out of my chest. Logically, in my mind, I was trying to tell myself it wasn't real. I know it might not make sense to those who aren't religious, but I started to pray in my head to make it stop. It felt like I was screaming in my mind because I couldn't speak aloud. It felt like an eternity before the sounds finally stopped, and I was able to move again. I rushed out of my room to my mom and told her everything. I didn't go back to my room that night. She looked at me with disbelief, but I'm not sure if she truly understood sleep paralysis or believed me. Regardless, it's something I'll never forget. My second experience was around the same time. When sleep paralysis started happening almost every night or every other night, I decided to sleep with the lights on. For extra comfort, my cats would sleep on my bed and cuddle with me until I fell asleep. For a while, I didn't experience any episodes of sleep paralysis, so I figured this was the solution. Like usual, I went to bed with the lights on, and one of my cats, Salem, curled up next to me. But then, I woke up with that familiar feeling of dread. I couldn't believe it was happening again. I felt like I was being watched. To my horror, I saw a white figure standing very close to me on the right side of my bed. My heart sank into my stomach. The figure had piercing bright blue eyes that were staring right at me. I glanced down at Salem, who was fast asleep and completely unaware of the figure. This made me feel a little better. I reminded myself that this wasn't real. After a few moments, the figure disappeared. Even though the lights were on, I didn't feel safe. Thankfully, I don't experience sleep paralysis as often as I used to, but those two instances are ones I'll never forget. And if you've ever dealt with sleep paralysis, you know exactly what I went through and just how terrifying it can truly be. I used to work as a funeral director, and the cemetery I managed was incredibly old, at least a few hundred years old, considering the church next to it was built in the 17th century. The place was situated in a rural area, so most of the graves were marked only with wooden crosses in the past, no stone or marble. As you can imagine, over the centuries, the wooden crosses would rot away, and new people would be buried in the same small plot of land. Over time, the cemetery became pretty run down and overgrown, with fewer and fewer people living out there. Since the cemetery had been in use for centuries, the ground had been dug up and worked over countless times. After so many layers of bodies, the soil was essentially made up of bone meal. It's not uncommon to unearth fragments of bones, teeth, finger bones, and so on, just by raking the flower beds or tending to the ground. Underneath, the thin grass is nothing but fragmented skeletons. The soil itself looked like sandy beach dirt, but on closer inspection, the light-colored particles were bone fragments, not seashells. It wasn't necessarily frightening, just eerie at first. You get used to it after a while, and you learn to treat anything that resembles human remains with respect. You just tuck it away under the plant or whatever you're working on and move on. There was one incident where someone was taking care of a relative's grave and decided to expand the area around it. For some reason, the people around here don't like grass and prefer flat ground with Zen garden-style lines raked into it. As the person raked, they pulled up a bunch of snow-white hair from the dirt. They must have panicked, because they ran out of there, leaving the cemetery attendant to find what appeared to be hair coming out of the ground. The attendant reported it to the church, and they supposedly reburied the remains. Even after all my years as an undertaker, I couldn't understand how a body could be that close to the surface. But there's another incident that still sticks with me more than that one. My business partner and I had just returned to the funeral home after a house call to pick up a 27-year-old woman who had tragically passed away. As we moved her body from the cot to the embalming table, we heard an audible click, and suddenly, the old radio across the room turned on, blaring static at full volume. It was one of those old radios where you turn the volume dial until it clicks to turn on. My partner and I looked at each other, pale as ghosts. He was an extremely religious man, and this event visibly shook him. He found an excuse to leave early, not long after. I turned off the radio and continued with my work, as I usually listen to music on my iPhone while performing embalming procedures. When I finished the procedure and was about to move her from the embalming table to the dressing table, I heard that click again. The radio turned on at full volume, blasting static again. At that point, I was pretty freaked out, so I left soon after. My partner and I never spoke of it again, and nothing like that ever happened before or since. It still sticks with me, though, and I'll never forget that strange, unnerving experience. I'm not sure what made me decide to share this now, but I've been thinking about it a lot recently. It was the first time I ever truly feared for my life, and it stayed with me ever since. When I was about 8 years old, my parents were getting a divorce, and my older sister and I spent a lot of time at our grandparents' house. It was a long, ranch-style home located on a corner in a peaceful neighborhood, just a 10-minute walk from a gas station, a grocery store, and a couple of fast food places. The streets were long and lined with neat houses, surrounded by the beautiful hills of California Valley. While we weren't wealthy, my grandpa had bought the house years ago as a fixer-upper, and the property value had skyrocketed since then. It was a safe, quiet place. There weren't many other kids around, but it wasn't uncommon to see neighbors walking their dogs or pushing strollers along the sidewalk outside our house. My mom was always very protective of us, but this neighborhood was dense and familiar, and my family knew almost everyone. She had grown up there herself, so she trusted the community. Occasionally, she'd let me and my sister walk to the Rotten Robbie gas station on the other end of the block to grab a snack. I would always pick a ring pop, and my sister would get a Three Musketeers bar. Then we'd walk back home, feeling grown up and independent. My sister was 11 at the time, and having this small amount of freedom felt like a huge deal. There was nothing like walking down that street alone in the summertime, laughing, joking, with a couple of dollars in our pockets. Felt like we owned the world. The one strange thing I noticed around the neighborhood was a small camper parked on the opposite side of the street from the gas station. It sat by the back fence of another house, always in the shade, with its windows covered by opaque beige curtains. I can't explain why, but it always gave me an uneasy feeling when I passed it. I was convinced someone was living inside because sometimes I would hear the air conditioning running, yet it stayed parked in the same spot. Every time I walked by it, the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up, especially when I passed the camper's door. I couldn't help but keep an eye on it, always fearing that one day the door would swing open as I walked by. What bothered me the most was a drawing taped to the inside of the door. It was a messy sketch with jagged lines drawn in brown-colored pencil, but it was impossible to make sense of it. I could tell there was some kind of shape in the drawing, but it was too vague for me to understand what it was supposed to be. I never had the nerve to stop and stare at it long enough to figure it out, but every time I walked by, I would sneak a quick glance. About a year before the incident I'm about to describe, my mom and I were walking past the camper on the way back from the nearby park. We had to pass it before we could cross the street, and I didn't want to seem scared, so I walked right behind her and didn't say anything as we went past it. This time, I felt a little more brave. I was frustrated, not being able to decipher the drawing for so long, and while my mom was feet away, I stopped in front of the camper door and took a moment to really look at the drawing. Upon closer inspection, the paper was filthy. I remember doing a project in elementary school where we soaked printer paper in black coffee to make it look aged, and that's what it reminded me of. My mom walked on without noticing that I had stopped following her. But my eyes stayed fixed on the indistinct mass of dirt-caked scribbles until I could make out what looked to be a tiny, malformed face. My stomach turned. I immediately felt cold and disgusted as my eyes trailed over the rest of the image. I didn't know what kind of creature it was at the time, but now I can look back and say the drawing was a badly deformed fetus inside a mass of large perfect circles, like those made by a circular ring ruler. His face was contorted as if in pain. It was so graphically disturbing and seemed to portray this odd sense of suffering that stuck with me for days. As a child, I didn't know how to process it, and the mental image still makes me sick to think about. I had never seen anything like it before. Adrenaline flooded my body and my chest hurt with fear, but I selfishly thought of my glorious little trips for ring pops and said absolutely nothing as I followed behind my mom. This was, in retrospect, a classically terrible idea. It's one of those things you scream at main characters in movies for. Ever since my ill feelings towards the camper had been elevated by the drawing on the door, I thought about it every time we drove by. And about a month later, my mom once again graced us with several bucks and permission to walk down to Rotten Robbie and grab our respective snacks. I thought about telling my sister about what I had seen on the way there, but she was older and braver, and I was terrified she would make me cross the street with her to check it out. It was a bright, sunny day, and I told myself with false certainty that nothing was going to happen. If I didn't acknowledge it, maybe it would go away. We walked past the camper, and it was thankfully uneventful. On the walk back, I was feeling more comfortable and was focused on fighting open my candy wrapper until my sister walked alongside me. We passed the camper a second time, but I didn't give it half as much thought as the first time. I don't remember what we were talking about, but I recall being interrupted mid-sentence as my sister softly yet firmly said my name. There was a distinct fear in her voice that immediately set me on edge, like a bucket of ice water. All my senses heightened and I became aware of everything, including the sound of haphazard footsteps about 10 feet behind us. It was accompanied by a heavy rustling sound, like a heavy backpack, and nervously, I half turned my head to look. A man with a long, unkempt beard and wearing many layers of ragged clothing stood behind us, eyes unmistakably burning into our backs as he walked. His movements weren't normal. It was a drunken shuffle, like each of his feet were unimaginably heavy and needed to be moved one grand effort at a time. His shoulders were skewed, head tilted downward with a strange arc of his neck. I could hear his shoes scraping the gravel with every step. But rather than seeming genuinely intoxicated, it was as if he was intentionally meandering our direction like a zombie with a direct effort to frighten us. Behind him, I saw that the camper door was wide open for the first time in all the years we had spent living there, and realized this was the man who had been living inside. He's following us. I choked out, my eyes filling with tears. My mind was spinning as I stared straight ahead again, and the wide street and sidewalks abnormally empty all around. My sister grabbed my hand. She squeezed it hard enough to hurt without looking my way, speaking carefully under her breath. On the count of 3, we race home, she told me in a very serious tone of voice. I couldn't reply through the growing lump in my throat, but every single cell in my body that we had to put some distance between us and this man as quickly as possible. She began to count steadily while we walked faster, and the most terrifying part is that he started running before we even had a chance to. He must have heard her directions to me and tried to get a head start by sprinting our direction before she got to 3. But his footsteps were noisy, and we bolted like deer the instant we heard him behind us. I'll never forget it. The chase felt exactly like you imagine in your nightmares. The fear your pursuer is inches away from grabbing your arm or a fistful of your hair. I pictured myself being dragged into the van with nobody around to see or hear me. We ran so fast we didn't even have the breath to scream. And peering back behind me about 10 seconds later, I saw him running in our direction with absolutely none of the impairment he showed with those zombie-like steps moments before. I think back on it now, and he may have been deliberately pretending to be handicapped to lower our guard so we wouldn't start running. The thought is terrifying, but I can't rationalize it any other way. We finally made it to our grandparents' house, and without a second glance behind us, we yanked open the stubborn old door, slammed it shut, and hurried inside, dodging their excited dogs as we raced as far into the house as we could. I don't think we even locked the door. All we cared about was getting to the adults as quickly as possible. My mom was talking to my grandpa at the table and gave us a curious look as we burst into the living room. She didn't ask what had happened. Knowing we were kids and running around wasn't unusual for us. We collapsed on the couch, out of breath. The house felt so safe and warm that I didn't want to mention what had just occurred. Like waking up from a nightmare you'd rather not discuss. I just wanted everything to go back to normal. I wanted to forget it all, unwrap my candy, and pretend everything was fine to maintain my sanity. That's exactly what I did. A few years ago, I asked my sister if she remembered the incident. Her response was strange. She immediately recalled it without needing any details from me, but quickly dismissed it, saying it must have been some bored homeless guy trying to scare kids with no real intention to hurt anyone. I'm not sure. I'd like to think it was just a misunderstanding, but like they say, gut feelings are rarely wrong. I truly believe in my heart that he intended to harm me and my sister that day. I never told her or anyone else about the strange drawing on the camper door, and I'm not sure if my sister saw the door open and made the connection to the camper. It's one of my biggest regrets. I would hate to think that other kids may have walked by that camper after us, unaware of the danger. I have a feeling he picked that spot between the park and the gas station because of the number of children passing by. The camper was gone within a day or two after that. I'm not proud of how I handled the situation and would encourage anyone who finds themselves in a similar situation to contact authorities immediately for the safety of others. I don't know if this story seems overly dramatic, but it was very real and very terrifying in a way I can never forget. As a woman who's been active on the scene for 15 years, I've encountered my fair share of creeps, though only a few have genuinely made me feel unsafe. To start, I've always had a laptop since high school. Back then, it was a luxury, and I worked hard to save up for it. My mom, however, would often take the money I earned for things I didn't agree with. Fortunately, the tips I made were in cash, so I could hide them from her. At first, my mom was upset that I bought the laptop, but she soon forgot about it, like she did with most things. My dad didn't care, and my older brother already had his own laptop, so when I turned 14, I started playing World of Warcraft with him. Back then, it was rare for girls to play, so I got the usual creeps. Most of them backed off when they found out how old I was, but not this one guy. This guy actually liked that I was underage. I was about 16 at the time, and I had already grown accustomed to creepy guys. I wasn't a newbie to the game anymore, and I knew how to handle the creeps. It wasn't surprising when a guy in my guild started hitting on me. I was 16, naive, but I knew I wasn't going to find love in World of Warcraft with someone I'd never meet in real life. Plus, I had a huge crush on my brother's best friend, who was off limits. I learned to turn guys down, even though part of me was still looking for attention. That all changed when my brother's best friend went off to college. I had a part-time job with him, but he was always surrounded by girls at work, and I started to feel demoralized about never finding love. Enter the 19-year-old guy from World of Warcraft who made me feel wanted. I had a camera phone by then, so I could post and send pictures. I mostly used Facebook, MySpace, and PhotoBucket. I had lost a lot of weight during my sophomore year, so I confidently posted bikini and sexy pictures, hoping to get my brother's friend to notice me. When this guy, who was also 19, started showing interest, I wasn't bothered. He looked attractive in his pictures, and his younger brother was my age. I thought he was good-looking and even made him prove it was really him by holding items I asked for. He started paying for my World of Warcraft subscription, which, in hindsight, was his way of getting my real name and home address. I was so blinded by my crush on my brother's friend that I didn't question any of this. All the lessons I had taught myself about online safety and resisting flirts went out the window. We spent hours talking on Ventrilo, and he made me feel special. I was completely caught up in the moment. He sent me gifts, and I didn't even stop to wonder how he knew where to send them. Then he offered to drive and pick me up, and it was only then that I started feeling uneasy. Luckily, I had a good friend on World of Warcraft, someone my brother met at PAX and who joined our guild. He's still one of my best friends to this day. He's 6 years older than me, but he never crossed any boundaries. He was more like the protective older brother I didn't have. He picked up on something off in the conversations, and he became my voice of reason when I had none. He noticed what I couldn't see. I told him I was scared to meet Benny, thinking dumb teenage logic that maybe he wouldn't like me. My friend chimed in that I shouldn't meet anyone off the internet at my age. I told him about the gifts, and I swear, I have never been scolded like that before in my life, not even by my own parents, but he always cared like that. He wondered why I would give my address to someone I never met, and the expensive gifts that I received were not something the average 19-year-old could afford. None of this ever clicked for me, of course, because I was lonely and trying to prove something to myself, that I could get a boyfriend. So just like that, I told the guy it wasn't wise to meet in person, and my parents said I wasn't allowed to. That's when he went dark. At first, it was pestering over and over, guilting me over the gifts he gave me and encouraging me to defy my parents. While he kept bothering me, it never once occurred to me that he would lose his cool. While my friend was worried about the guy having my address, going as far to drive the 11 hours to my house and explain the situation to my dad, as I refused to tell him out of fear of getting in trouble at the time, all while taking his spring break in my state instead of his own with his friends. There's a reason he's still one of my best friends. He has a little sister of his own as well, and she's my age, so his protective nature is natural. Eventually, he made me block the guy, and that was that. This guy was so angry. He would go on different accounts to accuse me of gold digging and using him. Luckily, my friend was smart enough and had the foresight to change my World of Warcraft password, and even paid for my account for me, taking this guy off of it entirely. As one of this guy's threats was to delete my account, but it did not end there. It got worse as he would consistently find ways to message me and tell me how horrible I was, till about a month had passed. I was walking home from school, about a 2-mile walk in the wealthy suburbs of New England, which I had done for years. Many kids did it as it was a very safe town with no crime. Without a second thought, I took off with my 100-pound backpack, put my headphones in, and started my 20-minute walk home. It was cold, so I had earmuffs over my headphones, only drowning out the sound more. I swear if I could talk to myself as a kid, I probably would just slap myself for being so stupid, because the World of Warcraft guy knew that I walked home every day as I had talked about it before. He knew my address, and I never thought twice. I was on the back roads walking home, and honestly easy to map from my school to home, as it was pretty straightforward with only one turn. At halfway home, in between songs, I heard a vague, crunching sound of tires rolling over gravel on the road slowly. I turned around to see a tinted black car, and you couldn't see much of the person driving. I jogged out of the driveway that I was standing in front of, assuming it was waiting to turn in, but it didn't turn in. The roads were dead, and it did not make sense for him to not go around. I swear, the saying that you go cold when you're terrified is absolutely true. It could have been a summer's day at 95 degrees, and my bones would have been cold. My heart just sank, and my breathing was uncontrollable. I felt like I had no control over my body as I realized this guy was following me. My blood ran cold, and my hands shook as tears formed, and my skin felt tight. My body felt like it wasn't ready to fight or flight, but simply freeze there and die. It only got worse as the second time I turned my head to see the car stop. I stopped. My world stopped. I couldn't stop staring, just froze and breathing like all my school books were on my chest, crying silently. My eyes hurt with no tears or sound as I just stood there. The door opened after what felt like hours, but only seconds, maybe a minute. And it was in fact him. It was the attractive guy from the photos. Not a catfish, but something seemed different. At first, I thought it was his angry expression, but soon realized he was definitely not 19, more like in his 30s. I could barely think over the loud sound of my heart racing as it froze me in place. I thought I was about to throw up as he spoke to me, told me to get in the car or he would light my house on fire. I honestly just couldn't move, couldn't reach for my phone as his words turned me to stone. And somehow, we both failed to notice the little old lady on her porch watching this play out. Suddenly, I hear her yell, "Get away from that girl right now before I burn you alive." We both turned to meet her eyes. A completely serious, angry small lady, about 60 or 70 with white hair. I think she noticed my frozen in fear state as she told me to get over to her quickly. Like that, I ran over to her, tossing off my heavy brick of a backpack. It was obvious. He was unsure what to do next as he stood there and watched me run to her. Must have been a sight. This tiny thin old lady standing in front of a teenage girl yelling at this man to go away. Just like that, Savior number 2 joined the battle as her husband stepped out. A man that looked like he had been through a war or two with a booming voice. I've killed men for less reason. You better leave right now. He got into his car and drove off as I simply collapsed. All that fear just came out as I cried harder and harder as my brain sifted through the past few months of mistakes. After calming me down enough to speak in non-hyperventilating words, she asked me if I knew him. I told her kind of, but only online from a video game, not real life. Of course, explaining it wasn't easy. She got on the phone with the school counselor. Her daughter apparently told her my name. I was well known to her daughter ironically, but it was only 250 or less kids in the school, and the town itself was small. Many staff at our school had family in town. Kids at school they were related to either by their own children or their siblings' children. It was the kind of town, if you didn't leave by a certain age, you were stuck there. So honestly, it seems ironic, but not entirely a huge surprise. The counselor was well aware of my family and my mom's addiction, as child services had been involved a few times. She came by in about 10 minutes to pick me up and asked me a ton of questions, of course, knowing I didn't want to involve the police as I was scared of being taken away from my parents again. We weren't rich, but we were more well off than many. Though my mom worked, my dad kept my mom on a tight budget to keep her from buying prescriptions from Canada. She wasn't prescribed. She knew all of this and knew though it would be rough, I was better off than foster care, which was a gamble with losing odds at best. Plus, 2 more years and I would be off to college anyway. So we didn't involve the cops, but she made me promise to take the bus every day and to inform my dad of this situation. She also called my dad at work to inform him and had a teacher make sure I got on the bus every day until I graduated. It really sucked, but I understood. If it ended there, it would be nice, but there's still more to the story. 2 days after this, my dad had to fly out for business. My brother was off at college, so it left me and my mom, who promised my dad she would stay sober while he was gone. But I was used to helping her while she was intoxicated. It was like taking care of a child, but I was on edge as every creak in that big house from the 60s. The cat stirring at night, the dog barking outside set me on edge, and I barely slept. My friend from World of Warcraft called every night making sure I was okay for the past month. I lived in the middle of the woods next to a huge river in my backyard, so there was still a lot of wildlife outside in the dead silence of cold months. Running water is an important source of water when the lakes freeze. I had been used to all the bumps in the night. Cats were coming and going, and dogs barked at every animal that passed by in the yard. But it all felt strange and unsettling to me as I lay in bed, trying to push my fears aside. The house I grew up in had 6 bedrooms. I had a little sister, but she stayed with our grandma in another state due to court orders. I was allowed to choose where I wanted to live since I was 16 and she was only 9. The other rooms in the house were used as a game room, my dad's office, and a guest room, which was mainly for when my sister visited. The house was big, isolated in the woods, and the thought of being alone there, especially with my mom being defenseless, felt overwhelming. It was when I was letting my last cat inside for the night that I noticed something unusual. At the end of our long driveway, between our house and my neighbor's, was a parked black car. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly shut the door and locked it once my cat was inside. I made sure all 5 doors were locked, even putting cardboard over the glass doors to the pool, hoping that if someone broke through, it would at least delay them. I turned off all the lights, gathered all my cats into one room to keep them safe, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. Now, about my dog, he was untrained and mostly just a giant puppy in his mind. He would growl at strangers but never barked at animals like he did at people. We kept him outside when we had guests because he wasn't well behaved, but he never bit anyone. If you spent enough time around him, he'd eventually warm up to you. But he wasn't entirely reliable as a guard dog. He didn't growl at all strangers. So while he was big with a deep bark, it wasn't a guarantee he'd alert us to danger. I sat in the dark with him, hoping for any sign that someone might be near. Eventually, I went upstairs to my mom's room and woke her up from her sleeping pill-induced slumber. She was groggy and still somewhat intoxicated, not fully grasping what I was saying until I started crying. Slowly, she sobered up and asked me to get her some coffee. I did, all the while keeping my eyes on my dog, knowing he would sense something before I would. As my mom woke up, the fear in her eyes became more evident. She finally decided to call our neighbors to ask if they knew anything about the car. After hearing that no one recognized it, two of the men from the neighborhood left to check it out. They found the car empty, but upon closer inspection, they noticed it was a newer Lexus. A laptop sat in the passenger seat, and while the car was locked, the tinted windows allowed them to peer inside with a flashlight. They never told us exactly what they saw, but something in the car made them call the local sheriff. There was only one sheriff in the area, and he lived in town. He arrived about 15 minutes later, ran the car's plates, and spoke with all the neighbors. It turned out to be a rental car from Ohio, and the sheriff was trying to figure out who had rented it, though the rental office was closed. He waited in his car for about an hour, and then suddenly, someone came running out of the woods. The sheriff shined his spotlight on him, but I couldn't see what he was pointing at from where I was. I could only see the back of my house while the light was focused on the side. I guess he called for backup as 3 other cop cars showed up in 5 minutes from the neighboring town, at which time a lady cop got out of her car, and I asked to speak with her, and for her to call my counselor at school to explain who that might be. I was pretty shy back then, but something about a female cop made me feel more comfortable to open up to. I told her the gist of the story, and then she called my counselor who backed up my story, but also was explaining why I was scared of cops because of my history with foster care and not wanting to go back. At which time, a mostly sober mom joined me, hugging me, doing her typical apologetic routine, but also offering much-needed comfort as she called my dad too. Eventually, the lady cop asked if she could take a look around the house to see if things were secure and get any information from my laptop about him. In her search, she found something I didn't think about checking. The basement door was not just unlocked, but opened. It's never unlocked, so I did not even think to check it as our backyard floods in the spring due to beaver dams, and it's got extra seals and stuff to prevent the basement from flooding again. But the stuff that was sealing it, which was mostly sandbags and stuff, were set aside. But the door at the bottom of the stairs was locked even though it did have some damage, like someone tried to pick it. But he did have access to half the basement that was storage, and the other half used to be used for my brother's parties. The door between the sections was like a front door, not an indoor door. As in the summer, my dad left the hatch open to dry out the basement and adjust pool settings as it was basically the pool house and the cats loved it. So it also had a few cat beds. The section that led upstairs was locked from the inside, and the wall and door were not drywall and were made of cheap material, but the lock and key heavy door was brick. Upon noticing this, my dad confirmed that he had not left it open. My suspicions that black car was his was pretty much confirmed. As we walked through the house to make sure everything was still safe, she got on my laptop as they searched the woods. I gave her everything I had, his photos, username, and she even checked to see if his credit card was still on my account. But it wasn't. But the last few digits were. She then asked to take my laptop for a few days as she thought she could get some good evidence from it. I asked her to please not damage it and return it as soon as possible because I used it a lot. This was before smartphones, so it was all that I had. After a few hours and the onlooking neighbors had gone to bed, the cops came back empty-handed, but left one cop outside of our house, and they towed the guy's car. From what the lady cop told me, what permitted such fear in the car was multiple weapons, some sort of rope and handcuffs, and the guy that ran back into the dense woods was wearing a mask. So eventually, I try and lay down to go to sleep, but pretty sure I was going to call out sick tomorrow and kept all my cats inside for the day. I was too restless to sleep. Every sound scared me. My mom slept with the dog in her room, and my cats slept in my room most nights by choice as my room was usually the warmest. At 3:30 a.m., I heard a knock at the back door, and I heard a man say that he was an undercover police officer and to open the door. I was still awake when I walked downstairs and saw a figure standing in the dark. He was holding a weapon. As soon as he saw me, he demanded that I let him in immediately, saying he needed to speak with me. Something about it felt wrong. My gut told me something was off before my brain even caught up. It was the way his voice sounded, forced, like someone intentionally trying to make it deeper. And why was he at the back door? I turned on the outside light, and sure enough, it was him. I just screamed. It wasn't a loud, dramatic scream like you'd hear in a horror movie. It was more of a startled gasp. I don't think my body was capable of making any louder sound from the fear, but the pounding on the door was enough to shake me. I ran to the front of the house and saw that the officer was still parked outside, but he wasn't getting out of his car. I didn't want to run outside myself. I'm not exactly the fastest runner, so I turned the porch lights on and off a couple of times, hoping it would catch his attention, but still, nothing. A minute later, my dog came charging down the hallway, barking and growling, almost foaming at the mouth, followed by my mom, who was furious and threatening the man. Somehow, during all this, the officer had managed to sneak around back and had his weapon drawn, yelling at the man to drop his weapon. I hid while everything unfolded, but the man was arrested. I didn't need to go to trial, and my statement was enough. I later found out he wasn't even American. The car had been rented under his friend's name, and once all the paperwork was done, he was deported back to Canada. I assumed that whatever was tied to his passport would prevent him from coming back to the States, and the cop assured me that he couldn't return. I'm not sure what exactly he was charged with, but my dad mentioned assault with a deadly weapon, attempted kidnapping, and possibly something else. It also turned out he was 32 years old, not the 19 he had claimed. I'm assuming that being a minor made it even worse for him, and I know there was another charge related to that. Life went on after that. I've had my share of creepy encounters before and after, but he was definitely the worst one I dealt with from World of Warcraft. I've had a few more run-ins with creeps through streaming, but now that I'm an adult, I've learned to be much more careful and better at keeping myself safe online. This story is 100% real. A little about me. I live with my mom, dad, younger brother, and our dog in a very rural area in Germany. This happened when I was about 13 years old. We don't have any close neighbors. It was a very cold Saturday in December, and I remember it because my mom only worked on Saturdays. My brother, dad, and I spent our afternoon watching movies. It was around 5 p.m. when this all went down, and since it was winter, it was nearly dark outside. The room was lit by the glow of the TV and our fireplace. At one point, my brother looked out the window because it had started snowing heavily. We all looked outside, and that's when my dog suddenly began to growl. He ran up and down the room, very alert. This was totally unusual behavior for him. My dad stood up to look around, but he didn't see anything. After a few minutes, the dog started calming down. We went back to watching the movie, and everything seemed fine for a few minutes. Then the dog started growling again. I noticed my brother was staring out the window next to our back door. I asked him what he saw, and he shook his head. Then, out of nowhere, we saw an elderly woman approaching our back door. We were baffled. Hardly anyone comes around here, especially not an older woman. She looked to be around 80 or 90, wearing one of those typical grandma aprons and a headscarf. Keep in mind, it was below 0 degrees Celsius outside. She tapped on the back door glass and started to smile in a really unsettling way. Meanwhile, my dog was hiding under the table, whimpering and growling. My brother came closer to me, and my dad walked to the back door and opened it a little. In a confused tone, he asked what she was doing in our backyard. She smiled and looked directly past him, at us. She didn't even acknowledge my dad. She took a step forward and shoved her foot inside the door. My dad immediately pushed her foot back and slammed the door shut. She glared at him, then at us, and started laughing maniacally. After a moment, she calmly walked away like nothing had happened. We looked at each other in complete confusion, not knowing what to say. My brother and I looked out the window behind us, but we couldn't see her anymore. The only way in and out of our backyard was a small path beside the house, and from the window we would have seen her leaving, but she never passed by. My dad stepped outside to check and couldn't find her anywhere. There were no footprints in the snow. There was absolutely no way the tracks could have been covered up that quickly, since only a couple of minutes passed between when she left and my dad went outside. To this day, we still don't know what happened that day. I'm not sure if it was paranormal or not. It might not seem creepy to others, but for us as kids, It was the most terrifying thing we've ever experienced. After my freshman year of high school, I moved to a different state. With my parents separated, I stayed with my mom, but once a month, I would fly back to visit my dad. Since I was 16, I flew solo. On one of these trips, I arrived at the airport and headed to my terminal to wait for my flight. As I sat there, I looked up and noticed a man staring at me. He wasn't scruffy or out of place, just an older guy, probably in his mid-40s. He looked like an average middle-class person. I didn't think much of it at first. Airports can be busy, and I tend to zone out. When my boarding number was called, I glanced up again and saw the man still staring at me. This time, he grinned. At that point, I felt uncomfortable. But since the airline had open seating, I decided to sit in the back, hoping he wouldn't follow. Once I got to my seat, I looked around for him, hoping he'd choose one of the front rows, since there were plenty of open seats. But instead, I saw him making his way toward the back, and of course he sat right next to me. I was by the window with the middle and aisle seats open. And yes, he chose the middle seat. I was really starting to freak out at this point. I didn't feel safe around this guy at all. He smiled at me, and I gave him a weak smile before turning back to the window, hoping he wouldn't try to talk. "Hey, my name's Jack. What's yours?" Panicked. "Riley," I said, giving him my real name. As soon as the words left my mouth, they seemed to linger in the air between us. "Riley, what a beautiful name," he said, and I just mumbled a thanks and continued staring out the window. "What school do you go to, Riley?" The way he said my name made my skin crawl. I wanted him as far away from me as possible. I didn't want to engage, so I said, "I don't see how that's important." He raised his hands in mock surrender, apologized, and chuckled. Then he started telling me about his job as a college football referee. He asked if I was a cheerleader, probably because I was wearing my cheer jacket. I nodded, hoping he would just drop it. Thankfully, someone came and sat in the aisle seat, which seemed to break the tension. Jack stopped talking, but he kept staring at me. I turned my head away from him, lowered it, and pretended to sleep. Eventually, I dozed off, only to be woken by the plane landing. Relief flooded through my body as the plane landed. But then I heard his voice. "You're such a cute sleeper. I wish you would have never woken up," he said, with a grin that sent chills down my spine. My eyes shot wide open, and a cold wave of fear washed over me. I didn't respond. I just quickly unbuckled my seatbelt, pretending I was trying to get off the plane. As the aisle started to clear out, he walked past me but stopped and looked back at me. I waited for 4 people to pass before stepping into the aisle, and I noticed the anger in his eyes as he stared at me. He kept walking down the aisle with his head down, but I felt his gaze on me the entire time. When I reached the front of the plane, I made my usual habit of thanking the flight attendants and the pilot. But before I could finish, the flight attendant pulled me aside. "Hey, do you know that man who was sitting next to you?" she asked. I shook my head, no. Her face turned as pale as a ghost. "When you fell asleep, he was taking pictures of you and telling us how cute his daughter looked while she was sleeping," she continued, looking concerned. "Your body language just seemed off, and it didn't sit right with me." I asked her if she could walk me to baggage claim, and she agreed since she had some time. As we exited the plane and entered the airport, I saw Jack standing by the entrance, waiting for me. She told me to keep walking, and I did, my heart racing. When I finally saw my dad, I ran into his arms. I could feel Jack's eyes on me, and I watched as he turned and walked in the opposite direction. I still don't know what his intentions were, and I'm grateful I never found out. What unnerved me most was realizing that my school's initials were clearly visible on my jacket. That made me even more uneasy.